Yeah, because Chaol, Aedion, and Dorian were quite literally facing danger every day while Aelin was gallivanting with her fairy prince in Wendlin.
There's not.
I know. But when Chaol said that, I was cracking up. I'm like, boy, I just picture like Rowan and Aelin frolicking through a field of daisies, like Twilight style, laying in the field of flowers.
Hi everyone! Welcome back to the Book Down Fantasy podcast. We, Addison and Lorraine, are two best friends who explore the world of fantasy through books, shows, and movies, but with a heavy emphasis on books. Welcome to our very first episode, moving into the next book of the Throne of Glass series, Queen of Shadows!
Yay, finally! I literally thought we would never finish Heir of Fire.
We did, though, and we are moving on.
Although
sure maybe did. Not for the better, considering how this first part of Queen of Shadows was very unpleasant to read, to be honest. It was hard.
I want to be transparent. Guys, I texted Lorraine and I said, I gotta be honest, I'm not enjoying Queen of Shadows so far. I don't know why. I wasn't in. I don't like it right now. I'm sure that will change very rapidly. We're literally like 50 pages in of like a 700-page book, but I don't know what I was expecting. More excitement, more something. And it was just like a totally different direction than where I thought it was going to go. And I'm just confused and annoyed and like, where's Abraxos? Where is Abraxos?
I know there was a lot of tension. It's very clear that everyone is on edge, which I guess like taking a step back and thinking about where the plot is does make sense because there's just been a very huge attack on the King of Aderlin's forces. The King of Aderlin went berserk and did a bunch of shit. And now they're like moving into the next stages of a much bigger war, it feels like. So
I guess hearing you say that, when you think about it, quite literally everyone is in peril. Dorian in peril, Aedion in peril, Aelin in peril, Chaol in peril. Everybody is in peril. And so I guess maybe my feelings are me absorbing the characters' feelings because I feel angry, confused, frustrated. I kind of just want to take a nap and not deal with all my problems, So maybe I'm just reflecting how the characters feel.
Yeah, this one definitely struck some chords, or this set of chapters, I should say. Anyways, as a quick reminder, we will be discussing chapters 1 through 7 specifically, but it is likely that references to all the books we've covered so far will come up as well. This includes Tab, TOG, Calm, and now Heir of Fire. If you haven't finished all of these books and you don't want any spoilers, make sure that you pause here and then come back when you're caught up. Otherwise, the series is brand new to us. You won't be getting any spoilers for the rest of the series, but you will be getting plenty of unhinged theories. Furthermore, we would like to remind everyone that this is an adult podcast where we will have explicit conversations. Explicit language or potentially triggering topics may be discussed, so please be mindful of that and adjust accordingly. Housekeeping. If you are reading along with us, then next week's Queen of Shadows episode will cover chapters 8 through 13. And next, Addison, where are we at with the Onyx Storm countdown?
While our Queen of Shadows characters may be annoying me, our Scythe characters are only bringing me joy, at least for now. We'll see how it goes. So I am happy to say that today, the day we're recording, is November 16th, and there are 66 days until Onyx Storm is released. And man, it cannot come fast enough because if this is how the rest of Queen of Shadows is going to go, I'm going to need a little break, okay? And Onyx Storm seems like the perfect way to escape.
I don't know. The Onyx Storm characters seem like they might be in peril as well, though.
True. That's very true. But they're mostly all getting along and have a common goal. They're not at each other's throats. So
very true. Yeah, you're right. Finally, if you are enjoying the show, then the very best way for you to support us is to rate our podcast, leave a review, and share it with a friend. If you have not done so yet, then go ahead and do it right now. Pause for you to do it now. Open up whatever app you're on and get your rating or review in. Because honestly, we just love hearing from you all, and it helps us grow our little book club community. All right, that is all for housekeeping. So let's get into the episode. We will start with the book report for chapter summaries, and then we will dive into an analysis and offer theories for each chapter. And finally, we will share our favorite moments. With that being said, Addison, please give us the book report.
Happily. No, not happily at all. Annoyed. Annoyed, annoyingly. Yeah. Sorry, I went on autopilot for a second. And I was like, wait a minute. I'm not happy. I'm not happy at all. Chapter 1. There was a thing waiting in the darkness. Dorian could not remember his name, or that he was a prince for that matter. He didn't know when the man on the glass throne clamped the collar of black stone around his neck. All he knew was that there had been a lovely woman who that man had ordered beheaded, and that he should have saved her. Over and over again, he heard her words, "I was not supposed to love you." He knew that he should fight, knew that he should struggle, but there was that thing waiting in the darkness, and he could not bring himself to fight it for much longer. Which, you know, reading this back, I'm like, no wonder I wasn't feeling good going into this book. Like, hello, that is really, really depressing.
As Akon would say, Dorian's locked up. He can't get out.
Thank you, Akon. That's so true. Okay. Chapter 2. Aelin went to the vaults to see what information she could overhear about the captain of the guard, and it was a fortunate coincidence that her former master, Erebin Hamel, also happened to be there. While she waited for Erebin to be done meeting with his client, she reflected on her journey across the great ocean from Wenlin back to Aurelia and how she missed Rowan. She spent the majority of her time planning to bury the 2 men in Rifthold that had shattered her life, again and again. As she watched Erebin from the bar, she realized that the client Erebin was meeting was none other than Chaol Westfall. Chapter 3. It is finally time to get to the outstanding question Addison has been asking for months. Where is Erebin Himmel? What is he doing? And why? Just why everything? Why does he even exist? Aelin confronts Erebin in the vaults, and boy, do things get good. And the never-ending chess match between the two of them, they engage in a verbal sparring match that dances around the past, makes plans for the present, and promises more for the future. Erebin offers to help rescue Aedion in exchange for Aelin, capturing and bringing one of the valg demons to the Assassin's Keep. Before he departs, he weaves a spiderweb of words that were as beautiful as they were deadly. As he exited, Aelin picked up a copper and flipped it. Heads, Erebin had betrayed her. Tails, it was the king's men. The coin was still rotating when the king's guards entered the vaults. Landing on tails as she unsheathed her sword, ready for bloodshed, Erebin hadn't betrayed her. Yet. Chapter 4. Aedion Ashriver knew he was going to die, and soon. He knew he would either die from the festering infection raging through his body or at the grand execution the king had planned for him in just a few days. Either way, Aedion just hoped death arrived to claim him before Aelin did. Chapter 5. After opening a can of whoop-ass at the vaults, Aelin was on the run. With several of the king's new guards in hot pursuit, she made her way through the slums of Rifthold, first stopping at some random people's house, which I'm sure they appreciated, and ultimately ending up in the sewers. Once in the sewers, she ran into none other than the mysterious hooded female bodyguard that was with Chaol during his meeting with Erebin. The mystery woman prompts Aelin to follow her, and she reluctantly does so. And just as they are about to reach their destination, Aelin decided she'd had enough. Aelin angled her knife and slipped up behind the woman as close as a lever and pressed the blade against her throat. Chapter 6. The mystery woman quickly gives Aelin enough information to get her to back off, but the tension is still so thick you could cut it with a knife. She finally tells Aelin they have arrived. She and Chaol lock eyes, and he didn't smile. I got secondhand embarrassment for some of this. I was like, oh, God. Chapter 7. It's the reunion we've all been waiting for, Aelin and Chaol. And folks, let me tell you, it did not go well. Chaol and Aelin play catch-up and both share what happened to each of them over the past few months. After that, things got ugly. Chaol and Aelin have a huge throwdown knockout fight, and some harsh words, and I do mean harsh, were said by both parties. As you can probably guess, they did not part on good terms. Afterwards, they both process everything that has just happened between the two of them, and let's just say we've got a long journey of personal growth for our two beloved characters. And that concludes the book report.
Thank you.
Man, chapter 7 was a beast. I rewrote that summary like 8 times. At one point, it was like a whole page. And I was like, okay, let me just wind it back in. I started arguing in the summaries. I was like, what is the most base form of that chapter? And basically, it was they saw each other, they caught each other up, they had a big fight, and then they left, and Aelin took a bath. Like, that's really what happened in that chapter.
Yeah, that was it was a heated chapter, and we have a lot of thoughts about it. So
a lot. Yeah. This episode really will just be 1 through 6 in like 20 minutes, and then chapter 7 for 2 hours. So
sorry, everybody, in advance. Consider yourself warned. So without further ado, let's get into the analysis. And of course, we have some of Addison's overarching thoughts to get us started with. So go ahead.
Of course. I always enjoy doing the overarching thoughts when it's a new book. So let's start with the cover. To clarify, I'm talking about the newer covers, the ones that you can currently buy at Target. Although if anyone has a line on where I can get an original set, please hit me up. There were 3 things. eBay, right? I know, but they're like $600. And I'm like, okay.
Fair enough.
I get jealous of those people on Reddit who are like, look what I found at a garage sale. And I'm like, damn, I got to start going to some garage sales, you know?
How'd you get so lucky? I know.
Lucky. I just know like a brand new, basically untouched set that like some mom bought for her daughter because she thought she'd like it and her daughter hates reading. It's just sitting in a garage somewhere. That's the set I need. Okay. So if you're that mom or your mom did that for you, send them to me. Of course, if you're listening to this podcast, you probably left them in a glass, so you probably wouldn't give them up. But anyway, I digress. So there were 3 things I thought were of note. The first is that we see what I can only assume is a glass castle, but it looks extremely ominous. It's very dark and the sky and clouds are red. And I don't know about you guys, but a red sky usually means trouble. It never means anything good. When they say blood red sky, I'm like, okay, everyone's about to die. I think it likely represents the fact that dark evil trouble is brewing would be my best guess. There are also faded mountains in the background of the cover. And if you look behind one of the peaks, you will see a very faint silhouette of a wyvern. In my opinion, this is clearly in reference to Manon and Abraxos and really all the rest of the witches and their wyverns. And we have predicted they will likely play a much bigger role in this book now that they're in Morath with the Duke. Last, at the bottom of the cover, you see 2 things. The first is what looks to be the mouth of a cave. I'm assuming this is meant to represent the secret tunnels leading in and out of the castle because there is a winding path that leads from the cave to the castle. Also see a pair of glowing red eyes in the bottom left-hand corner. Obviously, the stuff of nightmares. But I think it could represent a lot of different things. For me, it most likely represents the evil she will face in the form of valg demons. But who knows? Maybe there's some other creatures with creepy red eyes watching her from the dark that she'll encounter. Next, we need to talk about the title of the book and what it means. The title of the book is obviously Queen of Shadows. The first part is pretty obvious. She is the lost queen of Terrasen. But the shadows part, what does that mean? Here is what I think it means. Aelin has lived her whole life in the literal shadows as an assassin, but also the metaphorical shadows of her past. The shadow of the Great White Castle in Orinth that, quote-unquote, looked over them all. The shadows of her parents' death and Lady Marian's sacrifice. Sam, Nehemia. I mean, the list goes on and on. The reality is she is queen of nothing right now. And it won't be until she steps into the light, the proverbial light, so to speak, that she can begin her journey as Queen of Terrasen. We talked about this a lot in Heir of Fire, but adding Mala, who is literally called Lightbringer, really plays into this theme of light and dark and good and evil. And so I think we're going to continue to see that, and I think that's reflected in the title. Also, since we have now officially started the book, part 1 of this book is called Lady of Shadows. I think this represents that she still isn't quite a queen yet in the sense of the way that it really matters, like her birthright, she's a queen, but she needs to gather her court and supporters. And the shadows part is basically what I just said a few seconds ago. And of course, throughout this book, she will need to operate within the quite literal shadows to accomplish everything she needs to. So, yeah.
Yeah, those are all really good thoughts. I think it makes a lot of sense that the shadows represent a variety of things, including the evil and what's going on with the king. And then also, like you said, the fact that she is basically operating in the shadows, essentially, and underneath regular society and how things currently are, so that what they're doing is not discovered. And I really like your metaphor of bringing Mala back into it too, and shedding light onto what's happening and the change that's coming,
Aelin's got to step into the light, man. Well, first she needs to get the third word key, then she needs to step into the light. Don't want to do that prematurely. That could end very badly. So on to my actual thoughts about this set of chapters so far. I really hate to say this, and I kind of mentioned it earlier, but I am not into Queen of Shadows so far. Basically, everyone in this set of chapters got on my nerves, except for Dorian and Aedion. But they made me just sad.
They're locked up.
They're locked up, but they can't get out. We're teasing something that we're going to do probably by the next episode. We'll let you know. So just, if you're getting a lot of musical references, hold on to that thought. It's possible I was just in a really bad mood when I wrote these notes, because I'm coming for everyone in this episode, okay? I don't like Erebin. I don't like Aelin. I don't like Chaol. I don't like nobody. Nobody, okay? I am fully confident my opinion will change very soon, honestly, probably by the next episode. But this set of chapters just did not do it for me. I was just like, what did you call it earlier, Lorraine? Keyboard war.
Oh, keyboard warrioring.
I was keyboard warrioring these notes, man. And I was doing it on my high horse, okay? I was sitting on my soapbox, and I was like I'm about to drop some knowledge.
Have you seen that cat typing meme?
Yes, that GIF, and he's just like slapping the keyboard. That was me for like 7 hours. Okay,
that was me for most of chapter 7. Yeah, I was like, oh my god. And then I had to literally reread this chapter. So I had to listen 3 times. I read it through a couple times, just trying to emotionally place myself in both characters' shoes and think about the context of everything. So, keyboard warrior indeed.
And I was trying to stay mature because I was getting real petty real fast. I was like, oh yeah, we're going to hurl insults? Okay. Not at Lorraine. I mean, like at the characters. I was like, your behavior is embarrassing. I'm disappointed in you both. Oh man. So, speaking of, secondly, thank God I'm an emotionally intelligent person, because it took almost all of my toolkit to wade through the conversation between Chaol and Aelin in chapter 7. All I can really say at this time is there was a lot to unpack. Buckle up, everybody. Buckle up.
So now that we have our overarching thoughts out of the way, let's get into chapter 1.
So this chapter is very short. It's just Dorian basically trapped in his mind. Ultimately, this chapter confirms for us that Dorian is in the process of being infiltrated by a valg, likely a prince, although that is unclear, but the language is pretty heavily implied. But it does raise several questions about Dorian's fate, which we will get into now and probably continue to talk about as the episode progresses, because we know that Aelin and Chaol also discuss Dorian's fate.
So one of the first things that I found interesting as we're swimming around in Dorian's mind is that he feels the valg as a different entity than himself when he thinks it was ancient and cruel and paced in the shadows, leashing him. Some invisible barrier still separated them, but the wall crumbled a little more every time the thing stalked along its length, testing its strength. And I point this out because it offers us some insight into what it's like to actually be controlled by the valg. We don't have a lot of insight from people. We only see people's perceptions of what's going on from the outside looking in. And I also wonder what this wall is for Dorian. Is it his own magic, or is it his own will that keeps the valg from completely overtaking him at this time?
Oh, that's a good question. I feel like it could really be either or both, maybe.
Well, if we remember, as soon as the king had tried to wiggle into Aelin's mind, Aelin's magic immediately riled up against it because it could feel it. And obviously Dorian has this innate set of magic too. So I wonder if his magic is trying to protect him in some capacity. Or it could really be both, because Dorian is fighting to try to still remember, who he is and everything that happened. And I would imagine there's some self-preservation involved in that too.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting parallel to draw. And I'm going to go ahead and say that, of course, any person would mentally try to fight back from that, but probably would be unable to. And so I think Dorian's magic, especially because it is so special and powerful, is very likely what's keeping him safe right now.
My next point is pretty minor, but Dorian thinks about Sorsha and describes her as a lovely woman with delicate hands like golden doves. And this just immediately made me think of Aelin's thought at the dinner table when they were kids. And she thinks his manners so elegant and graceful, his pale hands like little birds as they moved. And I don't know if SJM just likes birds, but I was like, why are there so many references to people being like birds? I don't know. That's just where my brain went. So
when I read this note, I almost spit out my water. It was like, I mean this so lovingly, like the dumbest, most pointless thing to point out. But also I'm like, you're right. That's so weird. What a weird way to describe them both. But you know what? Here's the thing. There have been things where I'm like, that's probably too crazy. I'm not going to note that. And then sure enough, it comes back up later. And I'm like, damn, it's too late for me to point that out now because it'd be like, oh yeah, you knew that the whole time. Then why didn't you say it? And so it's always better just to say whatever weird thing comes up.
Yeah. Say the weird thing. Say it out loud.
Say the weird thing. That's right. Yeah. Maybe she does just like birds. That is kind of weird though. Like there's no other animal you could think of. Now I'm kind of fixated on this. I'm going to search birds in the ebook later. All right.
Side quest for today.
Side quest.
How many bird references there have been in TOG so far.
I also found it very interesting that pretty much immediately after the collar went on Dorian, he lost his sense of self. This is evidenced by the fact that Dorian has forgotten his name. He does not have a sense of time or place. And more importantly, he has also forgotten the names of other people. More specifically, he'd forgotten the names of the others who had meant so much to him. This, to me, tracks because the valg leave you in a place of hopelessness and despair. And so it makes sense that Dorian can't remember the people he loves who have brought him happiness and joy in the past. Of course, Dorian being infiltrated by a valg is a huge concern for obvious reasons. But to me, the most pressing is how can we get Dorian out of this situation? To our knowledge, valg, especially princes, can only be destroyed by beheading or magical fire, which means Dorian is as good as dead, basically. The fact that he forgets who he is and his loved ones makes me wonder if that is going to be the key to Dorian being able to push the valg out, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Being able to develop his sense of self back will allow him the control and access to power he would need to push them out. I can envision this scene where he sees Aelin and she's like, Dorian, remember who you are. You know, like this big epic scene where because of that connection, he's able to finally kick the valg the fuck out. He's able to evict him. I don't know, maybe.
Yeah.
Or maybe his magic gets activated. I don't know. I'm very worried about Dorian, okay? I'm very worried about him and how we're going to save him.
Yeah.
I'm also wondering if it's a possibility if he will have an Aelin situation where he faces his worst memories and fears and then is able to push the valg out in the way that Aelin did. I also wonder if perhaps the king can just take off the collar. I don't think he would, but is the collar actually removable? If by removing it, does it remove the valg? I don't know. So maybe if they can get the collar off of him.
Yeah, it sounds like the way that they described the collars and the rings, they almost act as like gateways for the valg to infiltrate through. So I do wonder if, simply removing it, whatever that process ends up looking like, will cut the access point.
Yeah.
And so then they can't continue influencing the person. In either case, it's going to be a really big question. And I would imagine that similar to what Aelin had to do, Dorian's experience in order to free himself may require something similar. And I would imagine that Dorian's power feels to me like it would be of equivalent strength to that of Aelin's in a way, just like in a different manner. But if Aelin can use her magic to kill the valg, I could see a possibility of Dorian's magic also being able to do it, but it's just a matter of Dorian figuring out how to tap into it, I guess. I did also feel like there is a noticeable similarity between Aelin's experience with the valg and Dorian's current circumstances with the Wordstone Collar. You can tell that he has really strong emotions of despair, regret, and guilt from not being able to save Sorsha. And we know that the valg feed on memories and emotions that convey these feelings. And there was a quote that said, "There was nothing but that moment, again and again and again, and that thing pacing nearby, waiting for him to break, to yield, to let it in. A prince." Despite these feelings and flashes of memories of the events that led him to being collared, Dorian can't remember who these people are or who he even is. And there was a quote that says he could not remember if the thing was the prince or if he himself had once been a prince. Not likely. A prince would not have allowed that woman's head to be cut off. A prince would have saved her. I don't think we explicitly discussed this, but I do think this is foreshadowing for the likelihood that Dorian is infected with the Valg Prince, which we see more evidence of later based off of what Aelin discusses and how there is a difference between the demons entering through a ring versus a collar. And I think she also says it again when they're in the tunnels and she feels the presence of one coming.
Also, in this chapter, Dorian is thinking he was a prince, or maybe that thing was a prince. He's confused who the prince is, and it's very likely they're both princes.
Yeah.
I think it's safe to say that it is a prince.
It's a prince. Yeah. I feel pretty certain that that's
if it's case. Not, I would be shocked.
Yeah. There is also the similarity with Aelin's experiences of believing that they deserved this punishment when Dorian notes he deserved this darkness, and once the invisible boundary shattered and the waiting thing pounced, infiltrating and filling him, he'd have earned it. He knew he should struggle, knew he had struggled in those final seconds before their collar of black stone had clamped around his neck, but there was a thing waiting in the darkness, and he could not bring himself to fight it for much longer.
Dorian!
It's so sad. But again, seems likely that a big part of Dorian freeing himself is going to have to be an internal journey of will and finding his own strength.
I think so too. I really do. Now, maybe that will be aided by Aelin and Chaol or our beloved characters who are like, Dorian, you have to fight. You have to fight. I think first they've got to figure out how to get the Wordstone Collar off, or even if it can be gotten off. I don't know. There's a lot to figure out. And maybe we should be focusing on that instead of arguing. I don't know. Seems like a good idea. Possibly.
If only. So that ends chapter 1, moving into chapter 2. As Aelin waits in the vaults to meet with Arab Hommel, listening for any useful information from afar, she notes that brutal black uniformed guards were roaming the city like packs of wolves. So over the past approximately 2 weeks since Heir of Fire ended and Aelin journeyed back to Rifthold, the king has basically gone full lockdown on the city with his own controlled guards. We know these are the special guards the king uses for his dirty work because their uniforms are all black and they have the onyx wyvern embroidered on their uniforms.
Yes, and if you'll recall, we first met them in Heir of Fire when they were chasing Ren through the city, and Aedion and Chaol saved his ass by pretending to be high in an opium den. So this is not the first time that we have met them.
Yes.
I know we speculated at one point this was the king's secret guard back from Com, but then there was that note about how Chaol knew about that. So pretty sure this is a separate thing that Chaol had no knowledge or jurisdiction over, but we did meet them in Heir of Fire.
Right. But this is the first time that Aelin herself has seen these guards, because I don't think she met them prior to leaving Heir of Fire. We knew that they kind of existed based off of those brief snippets of what the king was doing with his guards, and we were suspicious about who those guards were, like the Rena Goldsmith scene and things like that. But yeah, Aelin had not encountered them yet until now. I also find it interesting that the king's sketch guards over here are referred to as wolves, and who else do we know who refers to their spies / informants / workers as wolves?
Who?
Queen Maeve of the Fae.
So I wrote actual gasp. I was like, what? I'm like, you're so right. And we did talk about Heir of Fire, that like, we don't have any evidence to support that they're connected, but it would not surprise us. It would not surprise us. I also thought in relation to this, when you think about it, there are actually a lot of references to wolves in the series. Aedion is known as the Wolf of the North, and Ansel had all that fancy wolf armor and sword. But of the three, I like your connection the best. And it also seems most likely there would be a connection between the king and Maeve, if any at all. But good call out.
Yeah, thank you.
I won't be saying that in chapter 7.
Oh, no.
No, I will. There was one I was like, I agree. That's it. Well said.
So Aelin notes that she needed to talk to Chaol and make sure he was safe, and obviously get information about what had changed in Rifthold since she had left. I think it's important to remember that Aelin has zero idea about what's going on in Rifthold. She hasn't really been able to communicate, save for the letter that she sent out to the king and queen of Eyllwe. So everything is different and noticeably worse compared to before in her eyes. Also, on the flip side, no one from Rifthold has any idea of what actually happened in Wendelin, save for this big news of Aelin Galathinius being alive and slaughtering the king of Aderlin's forces in some big, showy stand against the king, which obviously has been blown up and sensationalized beyond how it actually went down. I think it's important to keep those things in mind as we continue through this set of chapters, is that there has been no communication between
at all
both sides. No one knows for sure anything about what was actually going on for the other characters for the past several months here. So
yeah, because Chaol, Aedion, and Dorian were quite literally facing danger every day while Aelin was gallivanting with her fairy prince in Wendelin.
It's not.
I know. But I know when Chaol said that, I was cracking up. I'm like, boy, I just picture like Rowan and Aelin frolicking through a field of daisies, like Twilight style, laying in the field of flowers. And I'm like, Chaol, you need to quit it. Okay, you need to quit. It's just funny.
Yeah. Once Aelin looks over to the booth where Arobin and his client were meeting, we learn that she recognizes the client as indicated by the line, and still left Aelin looking across the hall toward the man who had shattered her life in so many ways.
It's funny to me that Aelin describes Chaol in this way, because I'm pretty sure that Chaol would describe her in the exact same way. The woman who had shattered his life in so many ways.
Yes.
And so it's interesting that they probably feel very similarly about each other in that way.
Mm-hmm. I also like that as she's waiting, Celaena reflects on her journey back, and that I think continues to demonstrate the deepening relationship between Aelin and Rowan. It says, Aelin had given herself a day at sea to rest and missed Rowan, with the blood oath now eternally binding her to the Fae Prince and him to her. His absence was like a phantom limb. She still felt that way even when she had so much to do, even though missing her Karanan was useless and he'd no doubt kick her ass for it. In addition, she sketched out a whole plan for what she'd do in Rifthold, including not leaving until she buried them both, referring to Arobin and the king. Once the ship had passed some invisible marker off the coast, all the magic she had spent months mastering had disappeared. Besides this, though, this does add some additional context to how Fae and magic wielders had become so dependent on their magic to defend themselves, because Aelin experiences this exact feeling coming back into Rifthold, and she's like, it all just disappeared. And of course, she's had a lot of training without magic too, but she very quickly came to rely on use of magic as part of a way to defend herself while she was in Wendelin.
Oh, that's a really good point. And especially because she even thinks, how had she let her mortal body become so kind of slow and not kept up with that part of her training as well? Because I think she's even like, Rowan would kick her ass for that too. And I'm like, that's a good point. You really did kind of leaning on your Fae form and your magic.
Eventually, the client gets up, ending the meeting, and this is when we learn that it had been Chaol Westfall meeting with Arobin fucking Hamill. Of course, my immediate reaction was, no, Chaol, why?
Oh, I know. And especially because we know that Chaol fucking hates Arobin for what he did to Celaena. Remember back in chapter 26 of Heir of Fire, when Chaol tells Aedion the whole story of Celaena's life and how she ended up the king's champion, he thinks about Arobin and he thinks it was her right, Chaol told himself, her right to decide when and how to kill Arobin. But if Chaol ever saw him, he wasn't sure he would be able to restrain himself. So I was like, what? What is he doing? And so I was extremely curious to know what could possibly make Chaol willing to even associate with Arobin Hamel. And of course, we find out. But
I think that probably speaks to the dire circumstances of what's going on. Just the fact that Chaol would even consider going to Arobin and setting aside his hatred of him to do that. I still don't trust Arobin, though. I don't think it's a good idea at all.
Well, I mean, nothing ever is with Arobin.
So that ends chapter 2. Moving on to chapter 3.
Okay, finally, I will be vindicated. We will finally get the answers that we have been asking for 4 freaking books. We will finally meet Arobin Hamel. And that's all I have to say right now.
Finally. I know, it's about damn time.
I almost wondered if he was like even a real person, you know, because he's talked about so much, but you literally don't have any interaction with him. I mean, you do in Tab, but post-Tab, you never meet him. So you're like, is he even a real person? But he's very real and he sucks.
He's been real and he's been running around doing whatever his assassin stuff for the past assassin stuff.
He's been assassin for the out there.
Yeah. Okay. Aelin is Justice's son, and we learn Chaol was Arobin's client, but she immediately wonders what had happened in Rifthold again. I also think that she was perhaps just a teeny tiny bit jealous at the sight of the female guard with Chaol because she thinks, who the hell was that? There hadn't been any female guards at the palace when she'd left.
I wrote, LOL, you right. You're absolutely right. She's jelly as hell, okay?
Aelin figures Arobin had intentionally planned for her to be lured to the vaults via turn at the Shadow Market, so she would see Chaol meeting with him. I haven't forgotten anything about what Arobin has done, and I really hope that Aelin remembers this as well. She thinks getting answers from Arobin would come at a price, but it was smarter than running after Chaol into the night. I don't think catching a valg-infected guard is going to be the ultimate price of letting Arobin back into her life, even if it's to momentarily rescue Aedion. Again, Arobin has something else planned that he is not disclosing. And this is just what he's telling Aelin, but I can feel it in my bones that he's going to do something else.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I just feel like that's par for the course for him. There's no way he's putting out his full intentions and thoughts and plans in an open conversation. I don't think he's capable of that. I really don't.
Uneasy.
I know. Yeah, uneasy. That's such a good word. Yes, very uneasy. But I completely agree. I will say that's the thing I both love and hate about Arobin's character. You never really know what his true motivations are, and it makes his character so fun to read and also so fun to hate and wonder about. He's a very complex villain. I really like that, honestly. He's not one-dimensional by any means.
That's a really good point. And it is very confusing going back and reading through these chapters because you're also hit with all of Aelin's conflictions about how to feel about Arobin too and what Arobin says to her. And you can just see how everything gets muddied and how it's so difficult for her feelings and thoughts about him to be separated and for her to think clearly about who he really is and what he's actually done to her because he is very manipulative.
Yes. And some of her confusion seeped into me and I got confused about Arobin at the end of this chapter, which we'll talk about when we get there. Lorraine's laughing because we had a very funny phone call. I said some things.
Aelin slides into the wooden. I probably should not have used the book words. I could have just said bench.
I was going to say like the booth. Man, you're trying to prove people we are literate, okay? We are super literate. Bank.
Hey, you know, you call me out all the time when I mispronounce things.
It's so endearing. It's one of my favorite things about you. I'm still reeling from armoire. Okay.
Armoire. Yeah, armoire. That was a bad one. So I will admit that was very embarrassing on my part.
No, remember, because you wrote out the phonetic spellings. You said it right, but it was just so cute how you wrote it out. That is a weird word. But no, I don't even know what a bankhead is. I was like, what?
I don't really know either.
Why can't you just say table and chairs? God.
Booth, bench. Yeah, literally anything more normal. But it's about time. We finally meet Arobin again to get some answers. Immediately, Aelin scans him and notes that there was no sign of the amulet of Orinth on him. And in the initial part of their conversation, Aelin says, I wouldn't want to wind up back in Endovir again. And I realize that this is not full concrete evidence, but in the context of this whole conversation with them and other comments that she makes, to me, it seems she is really admitting that she knows Erebin betrayed her. This had been a debate or a topic of conversation between us in previous books regarding whether or not she actually knew that it was Erebin that had betrayed her.
I agree. I think we always knew it was him that was responsible, and Aelin's hesitation was really just accepting that because the betrayal felt too big for her to face.
Right.
So I think you're right.
Erebin responds, I'd hate to see you back in Endovir too, though. Womanhood suits you, or should I say, queenhood. Aelin immediately thinks it had been a decade since they'd spoken baldly of her heritage, or of the title he had helped her walk away from, had taught her to hate and fear. So finally, we get confirmation that Erebin did in fact know who Aelin really was. We had speculated that he very likely did, but now we know for sure.
First of all, finally. And secondly, it's so funny because this was such a big debate for us. We could not shut up about this. I'm like, I don't know. I don't think so. But then it would be weird if he didn't know. But how could he not know? And now that we know, I'm just like, okay, cool. So he did know the whole time. Moving on. Close that question.
In retrospect, yeah, it was just very obvious, but we were just waiting for the official confirmation. We learned Erebin had heard what she did in Gwendolen, and that word had spread quickly in Aurelia about a fire-breathing bitch queen.
I'm thinking about changing the name of my phone for you from Baba Yellow Legs to Fire-Breathing Bitch Queen.
Oh my gosh. It is a funny title, and I like that Aelin's thought in this moment was, oh, she could accept that, you know. She's like, it's funny.
She's like, I'm kind of flattered, actually.
Yeah. While sitting in the vaults, Aelin briefly reflects on everything that had happened in her past with Sam, Rorik Farron, Iwan Jane, and Wesley. And as a refresher, Sam was Selena's first lover and fellow assassin under Erebin. Rorik Farron was a former crime lord, and Iwan Jane was his second. They were killed by Wesley, Erebin's bodyguard, and Selena, respectively, as retribution for Sam's torture and death. I am beginning to think that Queen of Shadows is where everything that had happened in Tab finally becomes relevant or comes back up. We're meeting Erebin again. We're being reminded what happened in Tab. Something is brewing, and there is a broader relevance for the characters we met in Tab.
I think that you are absolutely right. I know we speculated on this at the end of Tab, that these stories were not just fun, exciting character development. They were also meant to be connected to the story in a bigger sense. And I mean, given that a lot of Tab has to do with Erebin, that makes sense that it's now coming back up. But I think you're absolutely right.
Aelin remembers that this whole conversation was a delicate game of information and power, and her thought was it didn't matter if it was valuable information or not. It was the withholding, the power of it that he loved. And I think that's an important distinction to make about Erebin's motivations, continuing to be involved in Aelin's life.
That just really screams to me that Erebin likes to be in control. He always wants to hold all the cards. He always wants to have his finger on all the levers so that he can control the outcome to what is most advantageous to him in that moment. It actually, in a way, I feel like almost speaks to that. He's sort of morally neutral, and that I don't think he actually really cares about the morality of things more broadly. He doesn't care about the king and that he's evil or bad. It's just what is most advantageous to him and his interest.
Yes, he's a very self-interested character. And he, very much is one of those, maybe not morally neutral, but like politically neutral, so to speak. He doesn't really care who else is in power or like what's going on around him, as long as his own interests and his own plans are being left untouched, and he can kind of like do as he pleases, so to speak. So
yes, he'll align with whomever and whatever power furthers his agenda.
Before Erebin finally reveals some information about what had happened at Rifthold, Aelin makes a quick prayer to Mala and to Deanna, the sister goddesses who had watched over her for so many years. This is just another reminder that Aelin, quite literally, is God's blessed, and that she has a strong connection to both of these goddesses for reasons that have yet to be fully revealed. but they keep getting mentioned. So, of course, we will continue noting it.
Yeah, we will. And by we, she means Lorraine. Lorraine is going to know all the god stuff.
The lore that I latch on to. The gods and the goddesses. Erebin reveals to Aelin that Aedion had been imprisoned for treason and that he was set to be executed in 3 days at Dorian's birthday party, though he also acknowledges it was likely a trap for her. And then we get a heartbreaking thought from Aelin. She thinks, no, she could still see those plans through, but Aedion had to come first, even if he later hated her, even if he spat in her face and called her a traitor and a whore and a lying murderer, even if he resented what she had become, she would save him. It's just so emotional because neither of them has met each other yet, but they both just remain very committed to being there for the other, even if they thought that the other would hate them for everything that has happened to them over the last several years and what they have become.
I know. It's just so especially heartbreaking to get both their POVs when they think about each other because they quite literally feel the exact same way. Yep. Aedion is terrified that she's going to hate him for basically serving the king, right?
Yeah.
And then Aelin is afraid of the exact same thing. And they really just are, in this specific matter, two sides of the same coin. And it's so hard to read. I'm like, guys, you both love each other so much. Everything's going to be okay.
That's going to be my favorite reunion, or I hope it is.
Yes.
I can't wait for Aedion to get rescued, hopefully, and for them to be together again. So
I know.
Now, after this, as part of their conversation, Erebin reaches for her face and says, I do not expect you to trust me. I do not expect you to love me. I missed you. And I literally gagged because no, Erebin, get away from her. It makes me so physically uncomfortable whenever it just gives me the ick so bad. I can't with him.
And I think it's interesting. Aelin responds with a question that we have asked many times. She says, funny, I was in Rifthold this fall and winter and you never tried to see me, which is absolutely true. We discussed this several times. Erebin's reasoning is that he thought Aelin would kill him on sight, which, to be honest, in this moment, I took Erebin's reasoning as honest. I think that was a big part of why he didn't. And it didn't really serve his purposes to see her then. It's possible this is all part of some game he's playing, but for now, I think it does answer the question. But it would not surprise me if later he does reveal in this big bad villain speech, that's why I never came to see you, because I was waiting for you to blah, 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 whatever. So you never know with Erebin. You never know.
Yeah, I know we had discussed this topic of, does Erebin really love Aelin or Selena? And I think it's a very gray topic because I believe that there is some love on his part, but it's a very warped version, in my opinion, of what it means to love somebody. And it's also very wrapped up in his own desire to manipulate circumstances and have control. And ultimately, that is not the ideal way to love people.
I would say not only is it not ideal, it's actually bad. It's a very toxic way to love people.
Ultimately, Erebin agrees to help her free Aedion in exchange for one favor. And because it's Erebin Hamel, we knew it was going to be something wretched, and it sure is. Before he clarifies his favor, though, Aelin reveals the following. She reveals how the king had used archaic magic to stifle magic, uses demons to infiltrate human bodies for an army, has used rings or collars of Blackstone to allow demons to infiltrate host bodies, and that former magic wielders were currently being targeted as hosts for these demons. She does not, however, tell him about the word marks or the word keys. In this discussion, Aelin distinguishes that she thought only a collar can hold a prince. The rings are for lesser demons. So this was some of the evidence that made me conclude Dorian is likely infected by a valg prince. And now I'm wondering if Duke Parrington is infected with a lesser demon because he only has a ring.
That would not surprise me, especially given the descriptions in TOG when Chaol is looking at the Duke. There's that really vivid description of how his eyes would kind of go blank and It was if there was nothing in them. They were just empty. And so it would not surprise me if that was the valg kind of taking more control in that moment or sort of sapping away who the Duke really was. I don't think the Duke was a very good person, but regardless, it would not surprise me if the Duke as a human is gone and it's really just whatever valg is now operating his body. It did make me wonder if the Duke put on that ring willingly or if the king tricked him into it. Like, he was kind of always sniveling and up the king's ass, and he was like, oh, I'm going to reward you. Here's this super powerful ring. And the Duke put it on unwittingly. I do kind of wonder about that. But also, I hate the Duke, so who cares?
Right. Or I wonder if there is something specific about Morath that the king needed complete control over. And so, yes, he needed to get Duke Parrington.
Oh. Well, it stands to reason also that the Duke has magic in his bloodline.
Yes.
And so maybe
like
it was
Caltaine and
totally opportunistic. Oh, that's interesting. I've never thought about that. I just am so used to him being awful quite literally from like the third page of TOG that I kind of forget that maybe he wasn't always that way. Interesting.
I also do wonder what the difference is between how a valg prince controls people. Like, what are the symptoms or what happens to a person compared to a lesser demon that is infiltrating a body? Because they kind of seem to do similar things, but the collars needed for the princes and the rings are needed for lesser demons. So I don't know. It's just a side thought. Aelin also discusses how to kill the demons, including her fire, a sword through the heart, or beheading the collared ones.
I think it's also notable that Erebin says, not the usual sort, meaning fire. I take it. That does beg the question, can only magical fire kill them? I'm going to assume yes. Similar to the skinwalkers, no mortal weapon could kill them, only a weapon of magic, like probably a sword or also like actual magical fire that burns. It seems that Aelin's fire particularly has really strong magical properties because Rowan could not kill the skinwalkers with his magic, right? He couldn't suck the air out of their lungs. I mean, he could freeze them, but then they would just thaw. So the fire specifically and the magical fire together, that combination seems to make it particularly lethal.
After all this, Erebin requests Aelin capture and bring him a demon-infected body because perhaps it will tell me something useful. Major side eye. Aelin immediately has the thought, gods help them all if Erebin ever realized.
What if he knows he can control them and he wants to test it out?
Girl, I'm getting to that. Did you read my notes?
Listen, there were a lot of thought. Okay, there were a lot of freaking notes. I did read the part where you said it would be really bad. Okay,
I am getting to that.
Okay, I'm sorry. I just had the realization. Okay, listen. No, I have to read your notes because I have to see if I need to plug any thoughts. I don't remember it being phrased. Maybe it just clicked, okay? I'm an idiot, okay? Just love me. I'm stupid, okay?
All right. After all of this, Erebin finally makes clear his request that Aelin capture and bring him a demon-infected body because perhaps it will be able to tell me something useful. Major side-eye. Why would you be curious about that, Erebin?
Sus as hell. Sus as hell.
Aelin immediately has the thought, gods help them all if Erebin ever realized that he might control that demon with the amulet he had hidden away. And this is where I need the brain exploding emoji, okay? I don't trust Erebin for 1 minute. And this made me extremely suspicious that Erebin may actually know what the amulet is, or even if he still doesn't know there's a word key in it, I would not be surprised if he has learned something related to the dark magic. He definitely has more nefarious intentions than just becoming a vigilante for his city. And I believe that he knows a lot more than he is disclosing. I do not feel good about this request. I am very suspicious as to why he wants this demon.
That is a crazy thought. And honestly, it makes perfect sense. I know we talked about this in Heir of Fire. I think we discussed, do we think that Erebin knows that the amulet holds a word key? And I think our impression was unlikely because he would have acted with it already. But Erebin is a smart person and has the resources to investigate what the marks on the back meant or its value. And so I think you're right that it's extremely possible that he at least knows the amulet is powerful in a magical sense.
He also tells Aelin that nothing is without a price before continuing to do his creepy, loving gestures, which also only furthers my suspicion that getting a valg guard alone is not going to be his only price, because Erebin is masterfully manipulative.
Also, I have to say, nothing is without a price. It's just the freaking ultimate foreshadowing for basically any interaction with Erebin. I feel like we need to remember that every time that we talk to him, every freaking time, because he's just not freaking trustworthy.
Retweet.
Okay, I'm going to say something that I know is going to be unpopular, okay? To be clear, I still hate Erebin, and I know he is bad. But damn if when he talks, he doesn't just get me all freaking confused. He says, tell me what I must do to atone. Tell me to crawl over hot coals, to sleep on a bed of nails, to carve up my flesh. Say the word and it is done. But let me care for you as I once did before that madness poisoned my heart. Punish me and torture me, wreck me, but let me help you. Do this small thing for me and let me lay the world at your feet. And if that is not the most pretty words, I gotta be honest, when I read that, I was like, forgive him. Because I know. No, listen. Okay, this let me cue. Okay, I remember why I don't
see my face on YouTube. Okay, my jaw dropped and I was like, girl, get out of here.
Just for a second, he's very smooth. Okay, it's all coming back to me now. I am very hesitant to say this, but I believe in being transparent about how I feel in these deep dives. And in this moment, I'm not going to lie. I was weirdly kind of attracted to Erebin. And I know that's so bad. And it makes me sick to even say it. But let me explain, okay? Please don't stop listening, guys. Please just give me some grace. I'm trying. Okay, there's something about the way Erebin's character is written. He's just very smooth and confident and powerful. And he is a master manipulator. In this one singular moment when I'm reading, I want to believe him. I want to believe he's being genuine. My logical brain knows all the horrible shit he's done, but my emotional brain has other thoughts. If I'm being honest, it also doesn't hurt that Erebin is actually kind of hot. Physically, I mean. Okay, physically. You can't deny that, okay?
Yeah. I will say he's described as
very attractive. Yeah, and he's powerful. So. But I've said this before in the podcast. These interactions, specifically, this is a great example of why I love and hate his character so much. Aelin and Erebin have such a complex relationship, and Aelin's own feelings are confused when it comes to Erebin, and that really shines through on this page. I think I absorb a lot of Aelin's confusion because I think logically she knows he's untrustworthy. He's done all these horrible things, but because of their very complicated past, she has these fleeting feelings of conflict. And I think I feel that as well, right? I mean, go back and read that quote. If that is not the most incredible apology you've ever heard in your life, it's very easy to quickly be like, well, we all have periods where we make bad choices. And when that madness poisoned his heart, he's like, let me lay the world at your feet. I mean, it's hard to turn away from that, right? So I know he's bad, okay? And I'm not going to become an Erebin defender. I will not. But I just have to be transparent about my feelings when I was reading this. And that is truly how I felt in the moment.
Yeah, I do agree that it speaks volumes to how masterfully manipulative he is. He knows exactly what to say, how to say it, when to say it.
Yes.
To kind of sink his claws back into Aelin again and get her to start feeling conflicted about whether she can trust him or not.
Yes.
And I guess to add to that context, before Erebin leaves, he directs her to go visit the southeastern section of the tunnels that night and also says, if you are allowed to change so greatly in 2 years, may I not be permitted to have change as well? And again, this man is slick. I will give him that. But as I said earlier, I have not forgotten a single freaking thing that this man has done. His actions clearly counteract anything that he fucking tries to say. I don't buy any of it. And Aelin better remember that she is right to be suspicious of him. Until I'm proven otherwise, I have planted my flag firmly on the side of do not trust Arabin.
I have to be honest, this conversation is making me wonder if I'm just attracted to toxic men. I'm like, very concerned about myself.
You get looped right back in.
I would.
Bullshit.
I really would. And that's, oh my God, which is so funny because my husband is the most wonderful, kind, honest, caring person. But my fictional brain is like, ooh, morally gray, untrustworthy. Let's see what happens. Let's roll the dice, baby.
Are you feeling a little bored in life? You need some excitement? Is this what attracts you to?
No, I wish my life was more boring. I'm tired. I'm tired of all the excitement. I don't know what's wrong with me. It's like the teenage version of myself comes out and was like, yes, the more toxic, the better.
Consider yourself God. You got God by Arabin.
I am. Oh my God. I know.
So to end out this chapter, before Aelin leaves, she had an act of bloodshed to leave as an ode to the debts that were still owed. She flips a coin, and before it lands, the king's dark guards burst in at the top of the stairs, ending the chapter. Moving on to chapter 4. We check in with Aedion, who basically is slowly dying from an infection he'd received from the night Sorsha had been beheaded 3 weeks ago. And 3 weeks ago also gives us a little bit of a sense of the timeline here.
Oh, yeah.
He had figured out his execution was a trap for Aelin and had decided he'd rather die than allow her to risk her life to save him.
And we know specifically it's for a trap, 1, because it's obvious, and 2, at the end of Heir of Fire, the king quite literally told him he was going to keep him alive a month or 2, just long enough to see if a certain queen would come and rescue him. So this is quite literally the king's plan. And I mean, it's not a bad plan. I gotta hand it to him.
Aedion's thought was it would be such a relief, such a blessed relief to know he couldn't be used against her and that he would soon see those he had secretly harbored in his shredded heart all these years. And I was like, damn it, Aedion! I get where he's coming from, but please, for the love of God, also have the will to live. And you can't leave Aelin yet, okay? You're her sworn protector.
He has to stay.
All of them are just so willing to die for her, which is very, very gallant. But obviously, as a reader, I'm like, no, we're not ready for you to die yet, okay? So do not succumb to that kind of thinking.
Also, I am very worried that even if they get Aedion out of there, he will be too far gone from the infection for them to save him. So I am extremely worried that even if they get him out, that it won't matter. Because he even says only his Fae blood had kept him alive this long, but even that couldn't overcome the infection. So I'm like, what are they going to do? Because it seems like he probably needs magical healing, which I don't think will be available to him in the next 3 days. So I'm very concerned.
Unless someone finds him that way. Because remember, he was trying to keep it hidden from the guards so that they wouldn't see that he was infected.
Yes. I'm worried that even if, let's say even the guards figure it out and they're like, oh no, we have to save him so we can execute him. I'm worried that he's too sick. There's nothing that can be done.
Okay.
That's what I'm worried about. Like he needs magical healing, which won't be available to him because there's no magic. And they beheaded probably the best healer. So they can't use Sorsha's help either.
Yeah, that's a good point. Who is going to heal him?
And how?
Heal him? All right, that was a very short chapter, so that's all we have.
And we're very worried.
Moving on to chapter 5. Aelin starts by booking it from the vault after her fuck you to Arabin, and she is followed by 20 men in pursuit, which is still very scary in my opinion, because girl, you ain't got magic anymore, so you better run fast.
You better run.
She also knows that the guards chasing her feel off. And there's a quote that says she'd felt the offness that marked most of them who had been in contact with Wordstone or been corrupted by it. They wore no collars or rings, but something inside these men had rotted nonetheless. So my question with that detail is it possible that the king made these men using the word keys? Or if not, what did he do to corrupt them with dark magic without using a ring or collar on them? Is it just that he's like, hey, touch that word stone and like force them to touch it? Or like, how did they get corrupted? Is it just exposure? More questions about how these men became what they are.
Whenever you say those things, it makes me realize you are the most ill-equipped person in the world to become an evil person. You're like, hey, can you just touch that word stone for me? Don't ask any questions. Like, you would be the worst villain, the absolute worst villain. You would just be so nice. You're like, if you wouldn't mind, could I just please infiltrate your bodies? Because I need an army. But in like the best
Are you here for
possible way.
check-in? Okay, step 1, please go touch word stone.
And then step 2, like, review, subscribe, and rate the podcast. That's your evil empire right there.
Yes, exactly.
The
mass conversion.
That's mass conversion. That's your evil plan. Truly. Oh my God. Okay, so this totally stuck out to me as well. I think you could go in a lot of different directions with this theory, but my best guess is that prolonged exposure to word stones causes some kind of decomposing process with them. Remember how in Heir of Fire, Manon kept saying the men smelled off and the food was off and tasted rotten, and we kept speculating about what was going on there. But now, nothing ever came of that, and so I'm not convinced that there was really anything going on there, so to speak, but it's prolonged exposure to that kind of magic that alters them in that way, and this seems to confirm that. Remember in that conversation they're having about the parameters of the spells? And I think it's either Dorian or Aedion says there's probably like a current running through the Farian gap. And so I wonder if that proximity is what causes that.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I could definitely see that.
So it is also revealed to us that Aelin purposely planted a trail for the king's men to follow her to the vaults so that she could use their attempted capture of her to basically cause absolute chaos and mayhem and destroy the vaults. I thought it was particularly funny when she thinks, what a shame that the current owner of the vaults, a former underling of Rorik Farron and a dealer of flesh and opiates, had accidentally run into her knives repeatedly.
She did declare that she was out for bloodshed, so
she was not fucking around. She started her revenge immediately.
Yep. Am I sad that this happened to the vaults? No. But it definitely doesn't help her case later on.
I know. I'm like, why?
About being
unpredictable,
erratic,
yes. Irrational.
Obviously, she had good reason for doing this, but yeah, perhaps making a public display of burning the whole place down was not the best way to be an undercover agent. I do like that even though Aelin basically breaks into the people's home to get away from the King's Guard, she warns them to stay down while she barrels through the halls and also tosses them a silver coin to help them pay for damages later, which she's going to need a little more than that for some therapy because I would be traumatized from guards running through my house in the middle of the night.
Her behavior is always, I'm like, girl, how dare you? You're endangering these poor people. But then I'm like, well, I don't know. She drove me a little nuts in this set of chapters.
Yeah, it's funny though.
Well, it's frustrating because she planned for this to happen. I'm like, you didn't have a better escape route plan. You were just going to wing it. You're the fucking heir to Terrasen, and you're just going to play games with your life over destroying the vaults, which don't get me wrong, it's a horrible place, a cesspool, but is this really the best use of our time?
Fair enough. Once she gets to the roof, she recalls Arobyn's version of a white flag when he had told her you might find the person you're looking for in the southeastern section of the tunnels, and that's where she heads.
Can I just say, before we get into this section of the chapter, for all the planning she did for weeks on the boat ride from Wendland, this seems like a really shitty plan and also risky. It seems really ill-conceived. There's a lot of risk just to destroy the vaults. It kind of seems like she is just making this up as she goes, and that she underestimated the King's new guards. Don't get me wrong, that place is horrible, and I'm happy it's destroyed. But we have much bigger fish to fry. And I think it's funny that I did not read ahead in my notes, and I just fucking said that before I got to this part. So it proves that my brain is on the right path because I thought it, and then I was like, oh yeah, I guess I did say that in the notes also. Whoops.
Fair enough. Well, to be fair, these scars were an unforeseen problem that just popped up because she didn't know that they existed. But regardless, do you really want to piss Arabin off right now?
Mm-hmm.
We'll see how he feels about it in the end. So if we recall from the Assassin in the Underworld story from Tab, we know Aelin had gotten stuck in the sewers on a scouting mission to spy on Benzo Donaval, where she had almost died via drowning in that nasty, disgusting water. And this is exactly the memory that she recalls as she seals the grate above her and continues on into the tunnels.
Just remembering this literally made me gag. For those of you that listened to Tab, when we were actually talking about this, I started talking about gagging, and then I actually for real gagged, and I had the same reaction. It's so disgusting to me. Like, okay, see, I can't even do it now. Okay,
not going. Pleasant. So while down there, she notes the darkness leaking from the southeastern tunnel wasn't of the usual sort. And we know this is some foreshadowing for when we learn that the valg demons actually lurk around down there to navigate the city and feed on these magical beings. And more specifically, that there is a valg prince down in those tunnels. And now it is time for a new character to be introduced. Aelin chucks a stone down the tunnel, only to be interrupted by a woman's voice that warns against her doing that. This female guard is the same one who had been with Chaol at the vaults, and she's described as having a cool voice, tan skin. She's pretty, and is perhaps 2 to 3 years older than Aelin. Aelin is as sassy as ever, and suspicious of the guard, but her curiosity about Chaol and what's in the tunnels gets the best of her, and she ends up following her into the tunnels. The woman admits she knew who Aelin was and had seen her months ago around the city, which I thought was interesting just because, as we learn later, she had heard and known about everything that occurred between the rebels and the King's Champion before Aelin had departed for Wendelin. She also confirmed she knew Aelin was responsible for the chaos at the vaults and that the mysterious guards had no association with Chaol. Once they reach a walkway in the side of the tunnel, Aelin decides she didn't trust the woman and puts a knife to her neck. I know she should be suspicious, but I was like, really? Was that necessary? I don't know.
Okay, but seriously, she just saw her with Chaol, so it's probably safe to assume she isn't associated with the king. I think that's pretty fair to say. I did find her a little bit over the top, is a good phrase to describe it.
Just a bit, yeah. And again, just a bit. Everybody is very on edge. So nobody's trusted anybody, but everyone seems to be extra jumpy in their reactions.
Yes.
Maybe compared to usual. So anyways, that ends chapter 5. Moving on to chapter 6. So a quick round of questions reveals a couple things for Aelin. 1, Chaol no longer worked as captain of the guard and instead had joined the rebel cause. And 2, Dorian was alive, but he was still stuck in the castle. Although Aelin thinks it's self-righteous for the woman to be suspicious of her, I actually do think it's justified that she asked her own set of feeler questions, considering her point about how Aelin had killed many of the rebels back in Calm. The only thing I will say is that Aelin, in that case, was trying to protect Chaol, and Archer didn't exactly make her trust the rebels, even if they were technically working to put Aelin Galathinius back on the throne. Basically, all the mistrust and confusion boils down to a lack of communication on everyone's part. There's so much secrecy and lack of transparency between different groups, which is understandable given how swift and lethal the King of Aederlin is with his punishment. But still, I need everybody to work together here.
Yes. I have to be totally transparent. In this chapter, I found Aelin to be a bit annoying, and actually, I am on Nesrin's side. Aelin did kill a bunch of rebels. Yes, I understand they took Chaol, but she's also still now the king's fucking champion. It's totally reasonable for Nesrin to be extremely hesitant and suspicious. Yeah. Also, something I find a little annoying or off-putting, I should say, is when Aelin encounters anyone who pushes back against her, she always gets obnoxiously violent. For example, she thinks Aelin debated slamming the woman into the filthy wet wall just to remind her who exactly the king's champion was. That's a really aggressive thought, right? And just going to plant the seed. that sort of speaks to Chaol's concern later that she is unpredictable and she is very violent. Like, she always resorts to that. When have you ever been having a conversation with someone and you're like, I just want to slam their little head into the wall? Like, that's crazy. That's crazy behavior.
Fair enough.
She does this a lot when people challenge her, and I find it very frustrating. It's a very volatile reaction. And I think Chaol is a little bit right when they argue in chapter 7. I'd also like to point out that she's not winning herself any friends or allies here. Ultimately, Aelin is going to need every single person she can get on her side to overthrow the king, and shit like this is hot-headed, petty, and counterproductive. She's not making any allies here. She's not winning any friends. And I'm not saying she should just, like, braid each other's hair, skip along arm in arm. Obviously, be cautious, but why? The theatrics is, like, a little wearing on me a little bit.
Yeah, I will say, as evidence of some growth that she's made, at least she doesn't actually slam Nesret's head into the wall or anything. I mean, she does put a blade to her neck, but I think she has a lot of very aggressive thoughts. She does do a lot of very aggressive things as well, but she also has a fair amount of thoughts that she doesn't actually act on. And so I will take that as some progress for now.
Yes. I guess her anger management teacher would be very proud of her for not killing people, instead just thinking about it.
Exactly. You are not charged for crimes that you think about doing.
That's really ominous.
They arrive at the meeting place and hear voices approaching from down the tunnel, one of which Aelin instantly recognizes as Chaol's. When Chaol spots her, it says he didn't even smile.
Awkward.
Sad. I can't even imagine the sheer shock and tension both of them probably feel to finally see each other face to face for the first time in literal months, especially considering how they left off at the end of Crown of Midnight. Like, that departure was not clean cut at all. There was a lot of things they never talked about, a lot of unresolved feelings. And so now to see each other in the middle of a very high tension period of time, I understand, I guess.
Yeah. And I think ultimately, as we're about to move into chapter 7, that's what you're really going to see shine through in this conversation is they left on bad terms. There are a lot of unresolved feelings, questions, concerns. Yeah. And I think that is going to play out in this conversation that they're about to have.
Speaking of chapter 7, let's talk about it.
Woo! Okay.
So obviously we have come to the highly anticipated big emotional wrecking chapter. That chapter that left both of us very shocked and honestly in need of several rereads to fully piece together our thoughts about what occurred.
And to be honest, I'm still not sure I feel my feels. I feel very conflicted. And I reserve the right to change my mind about this conversation and what was said at any point in time, including but not limited to while the episode is happening. I just want to put that disclaimer out there for myself.
Okay, same. But something that's kind of funny that I would like to say before we start this chapter is basically the theme of this was a reverse trope of lovers to enemies.
If that is not the truest thing you've ever said.
There's such a strong undercurrent of we used to love each other. Now we're angry exes. There's a lot we never resolved. So I would like to preface before we begin our discussion to say that the fact that we feel so emotional about what happened is an ode to an author's writing and ability to capture the essence of human nature and emotion. Typically, when something gets me really riled up emotionally, whether it's anger, despair, joy, or any other just really strong emotion, it's because it resonated with me very deeply. In the context of this conversation, through the emotions of Aelin and Chaol, we are able to explore so many themes related to personal identity, society and systems, and the importance of lived experience on a person's interpretation of events that happen in the world around them. Most importantly, by discussing Aelin and Chaol's different reactions, it becomes very clear why the ability to empathize with others and communicate is so so important.
Oh my God, Lorraine. Chef's kiss. Yes. Everything you just said. No notes.
So, without further ado, let's dive into this chapter. So, the way we thought about this chapter kind of occurred in 3 sections. So, we had the initial part of their conversation where they're reorienting themselves to each other. We had the main argument, and then we had the part where they both go their separate ways and individually think about and reflect on how that conversation went.
Think of it like before, during, and after.
So, starting with phase 1. When Chaol and the other rebels come toward them, Aelin immediately takes note of the black blood on them and the dried out, emaciated look of their faces that indicated they had encountered not just a regular valg, but at least one valg prince. The tension is palpable, and Aelin is immediately overcome with emotion at the sight of Chaol. She thinks still the man she'd come to love before everything had changed. There were so many things she had thought she'd say or do or feel. She also immediately thinks of Nehemia when she sees the scars that she'd given Chaol on his cheek. And I do feel this memory is important to remember because it played a very crucial role from Aelin's viewpoint of why their relationship deteriorated in her eyes. Even if Chaol had been a victim of circumstance with the rebels and ultimately wasn't directly responsible for Nehemia's death, she'd still never been able to look past the idea that by Chaol not giving her all the information, he had demonstrated that he was still primarily loyal to his duty as captain of the guard, whose job, of course, is to serve the king.
Yeah, and I think this is further supported when she thinks even then she'd understood that what Chaol had done, whom he had chose, had forever cleaved what was between them. It was the one thing she could not forget and could not forgive, right? And so I think you're right. It does all come back to this situation with Nehemia. And we talked a lot about this in Calm, and I still stand by what I said then. I think she is way, way overreacting to Nehemia's death and how she blamed Chaol. I, to this day, stand by the fact that he didn't do anything wrong. Could he have done things a little differently? Sure. But it wasn't like he knew the king was going to execute her or question her, and he was like, I'm not going to say anything. The only thing is the king literally told him there's been a threat on Nehemia, and he didn't mention it. But this, to me, this language here is just so over the top. To literally say the one thing she could not forget, could not forgive, is so dramatic. And to be honest, I find it annoying. If anything, I feel like her outrage is misdirected, and she should be outraged at Nehemia, who quite literally orchestrated her own death. I could go on about this. I really could, but I will stop myself here. But I do find it very frustrating that the linchpin of the division between them is the situation with Nehemia that, in my opinion, Aelin is pulling way out of proportion, and Chaol's role in how everything went down. It's, I think, kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, I agree that there was a very large overreaction and likely some misdirection of blame. I think part of why that particular circumstance was so devastating is because then it forced her to think more deeply about Chaol's life and what Chaol's purpose is and how she hadn't formerly really thought too deeply about that, you know? And obviously, as we see later, and for most of Calm, they had been ignoring the realities of what their paths in life require them to do and be, right? They had tried to ignore that and thought that their love for each other could overcome any obstacle. But obviously, that was not the case for them. So
that's fair, especially about it forced her to re-examine who Chaol is at his core. And not to jump around, later in this chapter where she's thinking about, like, she had forgiven that girl who was so desperate for stability. She latched on to the captain of the guard, provide that for her. I think that's one of those, it was who she needed at the time, but not who she needed long term.
Yes. Yeah. So to continue on, Chaol dismisses the female guard, who we learn is named Nesrin Philique. And then Aelin has a thought, which gives us some additional information about Nesrin's physical features and just some demographic info about her. She thinks if Nesrin's family Name didn't give away her heritage. It was those eyes, slightly up-tilted at the corners and slightly lined with kohl, that revealed at least one of her parents was from the southern continent. Nesryn is kind of interesting to me. She strikes me as someone who is pretty fearless and also somewhat aloof, considering she's not scared of Aelin, is boldly wearing makeup that makes her stick out in an environment that is not friendly toward immigrants. And as Chaol notes later, she has no problem cutting down the king's guards. Like, it's hardly a problem at all.
I believe his exact words were, she filleted them like fish, which is kind of horrifying, but in a cool way. I have to be honest, my first couple reads of this, I found Nesryn a little off-putting. I think now I feel kind of more neutrally aligned with her. What I don't understand is her purpose in the story. Yeah. She feels kind of randomly introduced, which we'll talk about when we get down a little further, but I'm kind of on her character right now. But also she did just get introduced.
Right. We don't really know a ton about her. So Nesryn questions whether Aelin could be trusted, but eventually leaves. I do think it was fair, again, to question her because it's a very tense and scary time for everyone. And it matters more than ever who you can and can't trust. And Nesryn's duty is essentially to protect Chaol as part of her job as his second in command. So once alone, they begin conversing about the current circumstances. Chaol notes that Aelin looked different. He says, your face, the way you stand, you. This is interesting because Aelin herself has commented on how she's come into her woman's body. Plus, I would imagine that all of her training has significantly affected how she looks.
Yeah, I know she comments on her physical transformation, like she'd put on weight, her face looked less gaunt and hollow. And I think it's interesting, too, that Erevin also notes that in their conversation. He says something like, womanhood suits you. And so I think Aelin has gone through a internal transformation as well as an external one physically.
Mm-hmm. He also informs her that the king's guards were hunting former magic wielders and bringing them into the tunnels to be fed on before they were publicly executed later. Chaol also confirms that the king's guards all wore the black rings. And Aelin, realizing how dangerous the circumstances are, tells Chaol not to come into the tunnels anymore. But Chaol says, as regular humans, they were the only ones who could because the guards weren't interested in regular humans, only those with magic, including dormant carriers of magic. And this was why he had sent Ren Allsbrook to the north. Aelin is shocked to learn that Ren was still alive as a child of Terrasen from the past. And Chaol is also well aware of how the valg drain the life out of their victims. There are several lines that made me realize how difficult this conversation really is for them. And one of the lines from Aelin's perspective was 3 feet and months of missing and hating him. Months of crawling out of that abyss he'd shoved her into. But now that she was here, everything was an effort not to say she was sorry. Sorry not for what she'd done to his face, but for the fact that her heart was healed, still fractured in spots, but healed, and he was not in it, not as he'd once been.
I noted this quote too, but for a completely different reason. I noted the part where she says, months crawling out of that abyss he'd shoved her into. And I'm sorry, but what is she talking about? No, seriously, because I feel like she blames him for all of these things that don't compute. We literally just read an entire freaking book that was dedicated to the abyss in her heart because she failed everyone that ever mattered to her. Her uncle, her parents, her people, Lady Marian, Sam, Nehemia, etc. And she felt guilty about her past. Obviously, I know that none of that is her fault. Let me just back up. I don't want you to think I'm blaming her either. But I do not understand the dramatics from her in this scene so far. I don't understand. That's really strong language to be like, he shoved her into an abyss.
That's fair. I think my interpretation was that at the end of Calm, Chaol made that plan to go send her away. From his perspective, it was because obviously he loved her and he thought she would be safer in Gwendolen. But that whole decision occurred without Aelin having any notice. She was just very suddenly informed to go there. And in that experience, of course, had to quite literally face her own abyss. So maybe she is feeling like Chaol forced her to confront an abyss that she, at the time, was not ready to face yet. Ultimately, I think that it ended up being good for her, obviously, as we see in Heir of Fire, and it was really necessary for her. But I agree that continuing to blame him for that is a little, it's a little much.
I feel like that's fine. I would agree with that sentiment. But she can't punish him for sending her and then not also be appreciative and thankful that she was able to come out of that in a better place. So it's like, I want to punish you for making me do it, but also not be thankful to you that I'm better now. That's where it gets kind of messy. Yeah. Don't get me wrong, Chaol is not perfect. He should have consulted her. This decision to send her to Wendland was rash. And I'm not justifying that decision necessarily, but I feel like you can already see the tone of this conversation, how it's going, and it ain't going well.
Right. So phase 1 of their meetup ends when they reach the entrance of the tunnel. And before agreeing to meet back up later, Chaol looks down to see that Aelin had removed the amethyst ring he had given her. The line reads, Chaol gazed at that empty spot, and when his eyes rose to hers again, it became hard to breathe. We know that this ring was very symbolic for both of them, and taking it off definitely communicates that their romantic relationship is now over.
If that wasn't already obvious, yes, that is correct. And it's a symbolic representation of that being done. I like how Chaol throws a hissy fit and he goes to pawn the ring. like, my God. Okay.
Anyways, moving into phase 2 of this conversation. Aelin drops in on Chaol after he finished up his work with the rebels to get the victims out of the city and cared for. She takes note of feral urchins darting around the streets and figures some of them would be on Arobyn's payroll, but then Chaol begins his story of what had happened since she'd been gone.
He also tells her that Ress and Brello are helping him from inside the castle, and I just thought this was a nice throwback to TOG. For those of you who have not read TOG in a long time, Brello is the weapons master and basically ran the champion contest in TOG. He also trained Chaol from a very young age, and so that's their connection. And then Ress was one of Chaol's men, and I guess was until Chaol exited the castle. But I remember he was always nice to Selena, and in a few scenes, he was pretty funny and teased Chaol. And I think I remember when she's going to the Yulmus ball, that Ress is the one who like walks her, and he's like, whoa, you know, like, I just remember a couple like lighthearted scenes with Ress. And so it was nice to see them come up again and to know that they're still alive for now.
Yeah. And still, I guess,
Team
loyal
Chaol.
to Chaol, which, says a lot about, and this was something we had discussed back in Calm, I think, about just the way that Chaol leads his men and how all of them seem to be pretty dedicated to him. Chaol goes on to relate everything about working with Aedion, the night Aedion and Dorian were captured and Sorcia was beheaded, how Dorian had revealed his magic to the king to give Chaol time to escape, and how Dorian was now wearing a torque of black stone around his neck. Aelin recognized the torque as a wordstone collar, but does not tell Chaol about what it does.
And when she's thinking about all this, there's a line here that I think might be some foreshadowing for the future. She is thinking about Dorian, and she thinks, with that raw magic of his free when hers was not, it could be critical in defeating the valg. And I wonder if Dorian's power will be part of what is needed to put the word keys back in the gate. I started thinking a lot about the description of Dorian's power and how it's raw magic and he can shape it to his will. Whereas in a way, Aelin's power is very defined, right? Obviously, she's extremely powerful, but her magic manifests in fire, which is extremely helpful. But Dorian's is quite literally raw. Like, think about like if there was electricity that you could just push to whatever thing needed power. That's how I think about it. And so I wonder if that is going to be critical in one actually defeating the valg, but more importantly, it's what's needed to put the keys back in the gate is what it made me think of.
Ooh, yeah, you're totally right.
And I just want to plug this in here because it's something we haven't talked about in a long time, but it's prompting the thought as we're discussing it. How the hell does Dorian's magic work, even under the king's spell? I know we talked about it when it first manifested, but that is still a big outlying question that we need an answer to.
It must be connected to a different source. I don't know. It's also for the same reason that word marks can still work too. There's just something that's different about it that we need to keep an eye out for because I really want to know now. Once Chaol is done, Aelin then shares what had happened to Terrasen 10 years ago and what had happened while she was at Wendelin with the Valg princes. She does not tell Chaol what she knew about the Wordstone Callers or the third word key being in the Amulet of Orinth, only that Arabin was in possession of the amulet. So this is now where we are about to get into the heart of their argument. Introductions are now over, and it went 0 to 100 very quickly.
Very quickly. So get your popcorn, ladies and gentlemen. And just know if I sound really heated, it's because I am, but it's not because I'm mad at Lorraine or anything. This is just, I get very fired up, okay? If I come off a little strong, I'm just very passionate, okay? Right off the bat, you know that Aelin is not in the headspace to have a real, genuine conversation. While Chaol is telling her what happened, she's already blaming him. She thinks, you should have gotten Dorian and Sorja out the day the king butchered those slaves. Did you learn nothing from Nehemia's death? Did you somehow think you could win with your honor intact without sacrificing something? You shouldn't have left him. How could you let him face the king alone? How could you? How could you? How could you? And this sentiment comes up again later in the argument, and I'll address it more there. But I think it's really easy for Aelin to come back after months, hear this, and be like, well, you should have done this, and this. You should have done all these things differently, and put a lot of blame on him. And that's easy for her to say, right? Hindsight is always 20/20. And whether she's right or not is irrelevant. Chaol made the best decisions he could when the moment came. And I think that's something she's forgetting. And you can reverse that argument too when Chaol is like, you put on a big show of killing Narok. And it's like, okay, but you weren't there. Aelin couldn't have predicted the impact of that battle, right? So you can apply it both ways. But already you can see that she's on the defensive, right? She's very angry. She's not in the place to have a productive conversation. Another example of this sentiment is she clenched her fingers into the side of the brick building. How could he have served that monster? How could he have not seen it, not have tried to kill the king any time he got within striking range? I found this thought very frustrating. I think this is really hypocritical coming from Aelin. She literally told Nehemia and Calm that it was suicide to go against the king and to literally not come crying to her when all her people were dead around her. But now she's mad at Chaol for not attempting to commit regicide. She had equal opportunity to kill the king. And so to put that on Chaol is really frustrating. And again, I'm going to try not to say this over and over again. I don't think they're thinking logically here. I think they're thinking emotionally. I think they're both upset by what they have just heard. They have both received terrible news. Not like, oh, yeah, I'm sad, I'll get over it. But like life-altering, horrible news. And they're probably very worried about Aedion's fate and Dorian's fate. And so there's a lot of emotion here. But I did find that thought very hypocritical, that she's mad at him for not committing regicide. But she didn't do anything when she had the chance.
Fair enough. I would like to say, and this is something that I had brought up earlier as well, but I will say that these first two ideas that express how Aelin is feeling are thoughts. And she didn't ultimately end up saying them out loud to Chaol. And I do think that that nuance is important because she even has the thought where she thinks the grief in Chaol's eyes kept her from speaking. She took a breath as he fell silent, mastering the anger and disappointment and shock. I feel like what happened to Dorian, just to get in her headspace, feels a little bit like a repeat of what happened to Nehemia for her. But with that being said, there wasn't really anything that Chaol could do because first off, he didn't know the full extent of what they were dealing with in terms of the king. And they also, again, were not communicating with each other. So he didn't know how bad it could get until it got very, very bad. And to touch on Aelin's thoughts, I do think it's progress that she didn't actually voice those things to him.
That's fair.
Got herself under control. She felt very strongly about what she'd heard. She kind of reined it in for now and realized that this wasn't going to be a productive way to continue.
No, that's fair. Now. I mean, how can Chaol make informed decisions if he doesn't have the information, right? And it all goes back to our very first complaint at the end of Calm, where Dorian, Chaol, and Aelin did not sit down and go, okay, here's what I know. What do you know? Here's what I know. And lay all their cards on the table. And if they would have done that, we could have circumvented a lot of issues.
To be fair, Chaol could literally not kill the king. What was he gonna do?
Oh, I know. You really think it's as easy as just, stabbing with a sword? As if.
I would have predicted that for sure. Like the king would
Thank
have.
you.
And it would not have gone well for Chaol.
This is the same woman who literally couldn't even look the king in the eye, right? She was quite literally shaking with fear. And I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
You guys get the point. You get the point.
I think the overall sentiment from this is that they have had a fundamental misunderstanding or lack of information about the other's experiences. And so they are retrospectively looking at what somebody has done from a place where they have since progressed forward from. But they're not able to empathize with each other and be like, okay, I understand why they made the choices that they did. There's a lot of pointing fingers. So
a lot of that. But just remember, when you point a finger, there are 4, well, I guess 3 pointing back at you.
So next, we're going to get into some of the topics that were brought up within the conversation. And so the first one I want to discuss is Chaol feeling very angry that Aelin didn't return to Rifthold. And he thinks, without an army, without allies, you came back empty-handed. You didn't even try. I will say that I did find that line a little bit unfair, that Chaol is putting all the pressure on Aelin to fight against the king. And I say that because I don't feel that it's entirely Aelin's responsibility alone to figure out how to fight against the king. And this is something that, truly is going to take a group effort, and change also has to come from Adarlanians as much as anyone else, because the king is quite literally committing acts of violence on his own people now too. And so it's going to take effort from many different groups of people, I think, for this to work. I also don't think Chaol, to be honest, would be super happy if Aelin's entire extended Fae-related family shows up as an entire army in Rifthold, considering how scared and mistrusting Chaol kind of is of magical beings right now. It felt a little bit to me like Chaol was the whole phrase about like, you can't have your cake and eat it too, or whatever, as in he's requesting all of these demands from people that are related to magical beings and wants their help now and wants them to fight against the king. But he still has a lot of bias against them that he is really going to need to work through. Also, things become very gray very quickly, as we've said. He himself is wanting to go and try and work with Arobynn Hamel, knowing exactly what kind of being Arobynn is and what obviously he did to Aelin in the past. To me, I think kind of similarly to what Aelin is doing as well. Like, I don't think he gets to set aside and ignore a lot of the terrible things that human beings do without allowing the same grace to Aelin and some of the things that magical beings have done in their past as well.
That was a lot of words, Lorraine. That was a lot of words.
I see you have a lot of words back as well.
I do. And I feel like I just had such a hard time organizing my thoughts because I was just like, well, this is true, but also this is true, but also what about this?
Right.
Let me say, I do agree it's not the most reasonable request, and especially given that it wasn't communicated beforehand.
Yeah.
But from his perspective, she should have adjusted her plans when she realized what they were up against. But other than that, I'm going to disagree with basically everything else you said. So to your own point, it's going to take a group effort to defeat the king. The entire rebellion is centered around her. She is the rebellion, okay? People will not come unless she calls. That puts the burden of responsibility on her. I'm sorry, it just does. Chaol obviously, of course, doesn't understand what Maeve was like, so I'm not giving Aelin crap for that because Maeve is horrible and we probably wouldn't want her help anyway. But he is right that she didn't even attempt to talk to her mortal family members, the Ash Rivers, and ask for help. I think it is highly likely they would have helped since the King of Adarlan poses a huge threat to them, especially if she told them about his plans with the valg and the word keys. They may have been initially hesitant, but once you tell them the king has 2 word keys and what his master plan is, it affects literally the entire world. So I think they would be much more likely to get involved. She was thousands of miles away from the real danger that Chaol and Aedion and Dorian faced every day. And all of them, really, including Chaol, were quite literally risking their life every moment of every day for her with their proximity to the king. And I don't think it's unreasonable that he wanted her to bring something to the table. And also, at least at this point in the argument, I don't think him accepting her magic or being Fae really has anything to do with the argument as of yet. I think the issue is it unreasonable for him to be upset that she basically did nothing to help while she was in Wendlin? Because from his perspective, she didn't. All she did was master her magic, which is useless in Aurelia. So this is something I meant to say at the top of the argument, is that we have to remember that we as readers have a bird's eye perspective of the events and the characters and their thoughts, feelings, and actions. We know everything they've experienced, but they have a limited perspective. They don't know. Aelin and Chaol have not had any form of contact for months. So they're only going based off their impression in real time. And so that dramatically impacts how they see each other and engage in this interaction and how we see it and engage with this interaction. Sorry, that's something I should have added at the top. So I see his point. I'm going to give like 1 point for Chaol, half a point for Aelin. I kind of see what he means. But also, as I said, it's not like they communicated about this. See, once again, it's about the lack of communication.
I will say that Aelin was working against the king, essentially, as soon as they figured out what was going on with Narok and things. But Chaol was not aware of that. As far as Chaol's involvement, Chaol hasn't really gotten involved until recently. He did not want to associate, well, as of Heir of Fire, but prior to that, and his introduction was through Aedion. And even then, he wasn't fully in, right?
True.
I don't think he's gotten fully into working directly in the rebellion against the king until obviously these last month or so.
Yeah.
It's been a process for both of them to get to a point where they wanted to be fully involved. The next point that Chaol brings up is how difficult it had been in Rifthold while she was away. And his line was, "While you were off playing with magic, do you understand what happened to me, to Dorian, the city? Because your antics in Wendlin might very well have been the cause of all this. If you hadn't been so dramatic about it, the king would never have called us to that room." And then after this, he says, "What do I get to blame you for? Anything." He also does not say that the loss of magic was on Aelin, but he does imply that he kind of blames her for the fall of kingdoms when he says, "The second, at least I know without a doubt, is not your doing."
So I totally disagree with the last part. I don't think he implies that at all. I think it really depends on how you're reading that. I don't see how he logically, or based on what he says, is implying that the fall of kingdoms is her fault. He knows that the king of Adarlan invaded. I really do think it's a potato, like how you're reading the inflection of that sentence. So I don't think he is implying that, but it's okay for you to be wrong.
I just Chaol is very off kilter right now because his country, Adarlan, is now spiraling out of control. I get the feeling that he does think that Aelin had a role in his kingdom falling apart, so to speak.
Either way, things are going well. Things are not going well. So I think this quote shows a little bit of the hurt that Chaol's been feeling. We, of course, know she was not gallivanting around with her fairy prince in Wendlin or any of that nonsense. But she did spend months facing her trauma and healing and putting herself back together. And Chaol didn't get that luxury. He has not had time to process any of the major life changes he's going through. Chaol has had the burden of keeping Aedion, Ren, Murtaugh, and Dorian safe, as well as all of Rifthold. And I get why he's angry that she showed up empty-handed, and I get why he's a little resentful, because he kind of thinks, I sent you to Wendlin to keep you safe, and all you did was hang out with Prince Rowan. And I know it's not as trivial as that, but I can see why from his perspective he's hearing this, and that's what he's hearing. And so it's not necessarily a fair or a balanced accusation, because obviously we know what Aelin is really doing, but he doesn't.
When I scoped out and looked at where all of this was coming from, the way that I looked at this was from a hierarchy of needs and a lack of awareness about the other's perspective. I think where Chaol is right now, his entire world has been upended, and he's currently sitting in the safety zone of needs, where his primary concern is security and safety of his life and his home in Aederlin. He is primarily concerned that Aelin will bring Aederlin down as retribution for what happened to Terrasen. The thing that kind of bothers me about where he's coming from is that it feels very self-concerned because Chaol is not empathizing with Aelin for an experience that she has already had and lived with the consequences of for the entirety of her most formative years, right? Everything that happened to Terrasen was when she was 8, and then she grew up, and now she's like 19, and those are very worldview setting periods of your life.
That's fair.
I just feel like he's not seeing the parallels between what Aelin has already experienced with what he is experiencing now as well. He's just now entering into the phase of what happened to Aelin when she was 8. Really, they're experiencing the same thing, just at different periods of their life. When Aelin was younger and when everything went to shit for her, Chaol's life was actually relatively safe and secure as a citizen of the ruling country, which is Aederlin. And of course, thanks to all of this being implemented by the king, institutionalized propaganda, growing up in a kind of a bubble, more or less, where he was fairly insulated from the harsher realities for a long time, right? Like Chaol was mostly in the castle, so he wasn't super aware of everything else that was going on outside of the castle. And he was very shocked to learn some of those other things, right? Like going to Endovier and seeing what it was really like. But I think Chaol has grown up believing magic wielders are dangerous and scary because that's what he was told, and is also able to believe that what Aederlin is doing is necessary for his country. So I don't blame Chaol as an individual for the beliefs he has because he is ultimately just a product of a much larger system. But on top of that, Chaol's job was also so intimately connected with his personal life because his job is to serve the king and protect Dorian. But Dorian is also basically his brother. And this results in, I think, a much more deep-seated sense of duty to the country of Aederlin, as well as a respect for the hierarchy of Aederlin society. Again, I don't blame for Chaol for those things. It makes sense how we got there. But I think as an outsider, I can personally say that you can look at that and also say that maybe not the best worldview. But yeah, you see how what came to be that way. With that all being said, it does feel a little bit wrong, in my opinion, for him to place blame on Aelin as the cause of the King of Aederlin's sudden elevation of tyranny, because it is hypocritical. His blame is extremely misplaced because Aelin was fighting Princess and Wendelin. Again, Chaol didn't know that, but it was ultimately the king that had brought the valg into existence in Aurelia and started using them for nefarious purposes. There was really nothing Aelin could do except kill the king's forces because they were attacking her, and it was a life or death situation, just as Chaol's experience with these guards and the king's forces is also a life or death situation for him. So I kind of feel like a lot of Chaol's interpretation of what she's doing comes back to his focus on Aelin's potential to act on a desire for a revenge against all Aederlonians when she explicitly demonstrated that her intent is not to get rid of Aederlin. She quite literally believed that Dorian would have been an excellent king before he got collared. All in all, the only person who should be blamed for the fall of kingdoms is the king of Aederlin and the valg. And, you know, the king is a human committing some of the most heinous crimes against humanity. The king of Aederlin himself is quite literally the biggest threat to, and I really want Chaol to realize that because, yeah, in the same way that Aelin has blamed him wrongly for a lot of things, they have to get on the same page of who the enemy is here, you know?
Well, I personally think that Chaol Westfall should listen to this podcast, and I think he will be thoroughly convinced and persuaded and motivated, as am I. That was very beautifully said. I'm just so proud you're my podcast partner because There are a lot of idiots out there, and I could have got stuck with one of those, but instead I got you, and I'm just so happy. You're so thoughtful.
That was a very long
thought.
Sorry, everybody. Thank you for listening to my essay. But
her TED Talk.
I am not done yet. We get into the next point of Chaol refusing to tell Aelin what he learned about the loss of magic. So, as part of all this, Chaol calls Aelin unpredictable. And as we've discussed earlier, that is fair. I think Aelin has done many things impulsively in the past with her work as an assassin, killing Grave and Archer, burning the vault. But Chaol has also not seen and been a part of the growth and progress that she has made overall in her own self-control. Also, I realized that he hadn't gotten the full context of how these situations came to be. For example, her burning Maeve City. She didn't actually burn it, and she was dealing with somebody who, this is kind of a side note, but Addison and I had been texting one day about the different ranges of morality for magical beings versus human beings. And I think Aelin's burning of Maeve City that he had heard of is an example of something that falls in the, you got to contextualize it as magical being to magical being, not magical being to human being, I guess. But of course, Chaol does not understand that because he is not a magical being. And he's also getting fed some information that is not entirely correct. But with that all being said, continuing to believe that she did all of these things because she was throwing a magical tantrum or throwing a tantrum is also not a very mature way to evaluate her actions, I think. So
I actually wholeheartedly agree with this sentiment. I think it was very well said. Yes. That will be the last time we agree, I think, in this episode. I guess at its very core, we both agree that they're just stupid and they just need to love each other and get on the same page. I guess in the broad sense, we totally agree.
Yeah. So the next point is brought up when Aelin presses Chaol about how to free magic, but Chaol only says having magic free would result only in chaos. It would make things worse. Perhaps make it easier for those demons to find and feed on magic wielders. I will say that this is a fair point. As we discussed before, a bunch of magical beings who haven't had it for years and would likely need help learning how to control it again is a very scary thing to both magical beings and humans. We also don't know exactly what will happen to the valg if magic is freed, aka do they all just become free as well? And now they're like free Roman and Aurelia? Do they still need hosts and stuff? But on the other hand, my question to Chaol's point is, if magic can help fight against the valg who are there now, no matter what, would it not be better to give them a chance to use their magic and protect themselves? So
I lied. I think this will be the last time we agree. I do agree. Yeah. It's a tricky subject because I think Chaol is right. It would cause chaos and perhaps help the Valg princess. But echoing your sentiment, at the same time, he has to come to the realization that mortal beings, no matter how many of them there are, cannot contend with the king's magic power. It's not a fair fight. You really have to fight fire with fire. You can't fight fire with swords. And so I think you're right. I do understand his fear. I know we've talked about this a couple of times. When magic disappeared, people literally like dropped dead from the shock of it, right? So imagine it coming back. You have lots of people probably who were very young when they lost magic, so they don't have the ability to control it. You have people who may have now been born or adults who had no idea they would have magic. It will be chaos, but honestly, it's a necessary means to an end.
Yeah, I think so too. So the next thing that happens, Aeol, they
gone. I don't like that couple's name. It does not sound good.
No, it doesn't flow. No, Kaylin. That's probably
Kaylin. Well, Kaylin is no more, okay? From lovers to enemies. You know what I'm saying?
Ship has sailed, yeah. Aelin does fill Chaol in on the reality of what the Valg do to magic wielders, and that the only way to kill a Valg that she knew of was her fire magic or to behead a Valg infected being. And this does give Chaol some pause for sure. I will say I don't really like the idea of Dorian dying, obviously, and I want Aelin to hold on to more hope that they will figure out how to free Dorian. But the reality of what to do if Dorian cannot be freed from the valg is definitely a question that needs to be considered for the future of Aderlin. And I do think it's a fair question to ask. The next 2 points made are that Aelin should have warned them about the callers and that Aelin had only come back when, quote, it was useful to her. I also think that this is a fair question to ask about the warning part. But my counter to that was, who was she going to contact in Rifthold, at least? How was she going to be able to get the news to them without it getting into the hands of the king or Arabin?
When I read that, I was like, ooh, definitely, because she thought to warn Nehemia's parents, but no one else. There's a line from Heir of Fire that said Wendlin had a way of getting mail where it needed to go without the interference from Aderlin, and so she should have tried. I do get what you're saying about how would she have done it, but Aelin knows a lot of people in Rifthold. She knows a lot of the secrets and underbelly and all that. She could have at least tried, and it didn't have to be explicit, like, this is what the king's doing, could have been in code or something, you know. I do get his point there, but also, to be fair, Aelin does internally agree with this thought. She is kind of like, oh shit, but she'll think about it later, right?
Yeah.
So she does reasonably conclude that that's probably something she should have considered.
Yeah. Now, Chaol does reveal to her what he wanted Arabin's help with, and his grand plan is to kill the king of Aderlin.
Woo! Okay, before we discuss that, it's pointed out that Chaol does say that he had been trying to meet with Arabin Hamel for a week, and it was only that night that Arabin had summoned him. I just point this out here because this confirms Aelin's suspicion that Arabin was only using Chaol as a pawn in his game, that he wanted Aelin to see him there with him. And this is confirmation of that. Remember, she speculates that where she wonders if this was all just a big ploy. And this to me pretty much confirms that. By Chaol's own admission, he'd been trying to see him for a week plus. And then all of a sudden on this night, he was like, yes, I'll deign to meet with you. I just wanted to point that out there before we get into Chaol's idiotic plan.
Oh my God. As soon as it's revealed that this is what Chaol was planning to do, I was like, excuse me, what?
Say that again?
He is so far over his head. And he has no damn idea, which I guess that's the catch, right? Is that he literally did not know. How crazy that is. But
I appreciate the thought, but...
And quite frankly, this leads to a very real truth that does need to be carefully considered. Aelin points out that should the king die, if Chaol was successful with his set plan to kill the king, then Dorian, who is currently infected with the valg, would become king and they would likely be back at square one. Posits whether, if it came down to it, could Chaol kill the king? AKA, could Chaol kill Dorian if needed? I do think that Chaol will really need to consider this, and this is where duty and justice become very, very gray for him. Can Chaol accept the idea that killing his friend / king may be the best thing for his country?
Ooh, that's an ugly question. I don't even think I can answer that. Yeah, I think that would quite literally rip Chaol apart. I don't even know how he would even begin to work through that. Let's just hope it doesn't come to that.
Yeah. It's a hard question. Neither of those options were going to end well, but it had to boil down to what is the lesser of these two seemingly bad choices. And I think that is something that Chaol is going to need to think about deeply. You don't want to make the choices that you're forced to, but you're going to have to make a choice.
And that is going to be Chaol's journey, making hard choices. A lot of hard choices.
And hopefully getting some perspective on other people's choices in the past too, and being able to be like, okay, I see how it came to that. So they begin to walk away from each other, and neither of them agrees to share any more of their plans or information with the other. And I hated that. There was a lot of language and emotion that indicated this fight was primarily very personal still for them. But we saw how many problems arose from everyone not being honest with each other and working together. So I'm kind of disappointed to see a continuation of that because of their personal feelings. The final part of the argument concludes with Aelin arguing that having her magic right now would be useful and perhaps is one of the only things that could save them. And Chaol counters back to say, perhaps we're better off without magic. Perhaps magic doesn't exactly make things fair amongst us mere mortals. Magic makes people dangerous. Once magic is free, who is to stop monsters from coming out again? Who is to stop you?
Woo! Yeah, I was like, can we pause and take a break for a second? Because oh my god.
Okay,
guys, when I tell you, Lorraine literally wrote an entire single-spaced page about this. An entire single-spaced page.
I have a lot of thoughts about the thematic message of Chaol's questioning. All right, here is my essay. So, Chaol's argument against magic seems to stem from a magic can do bad, therefore it is bad line of thinking. And again, while I can understand how Chaol got to that idea, I don't agree with it, and here's why. It feels to me that Chaol fails to see how regular humans can do just as much bad if they want to as magical beings can. But that doesn't mean that all humans are automatically bad. And by extension, the same can be said about magical beings, right? Not all magical beings are bad. And I feel like he's disproportionately judging magical beings and people for many of the same things that humans do. They just happen to have the potential to be much more dangerous, which I will agree that magical beings can be more dangerous. We can't forget that the King of Aelin or Arabin Hamel are prime examples of human beings that have done equivalently damaging things as regular human beings compared to magical beings. And I also feel that Chaol's suggestion that magic shouldn't exist because it makes things unfair is morally wrong because it involves the oppression of another set of beings for things that are natural characteristics of how they were born into this world. Suppressing magic isn't going to stop bad things from happening. If someone wants to do something bad, no matter who they are, they will find a way with or without magic. Of course, having magic makes it much easier to do that, but it's not the only way. Life, unfortunately, is not always fair, but strategically oppressing one group for having what you perceive to be an advantage does not feel like the right way to restore balance and peace. Also, as far as we know, I don't think we've heard of Fae and Aurelia doing anything bad to humans or others. As far as I remember, they've always been portrayed as peaceful beings, unless I missed something. Please point me out if I did miss something. But
I don't think so, no.
Yeah, as far as I remember, they've never done anything to demonstrate that they were threats to Aelin. The King of Aelin, again, as a human, is the one who has done the most heinous things with magic in Aurelia. His point about who is to stop you feels like it's much more rooted in Chaol's deepest fear about magic and Selena. And it's the idea that unpredictable, wild Selena Sardathian will be the one who not only has magic, but is also in charge of a whole country. So I see why he thinks what he does and like how he got to that point. But it feels very biased because he's taking how Aelin was in the past, who Aelin is as a magical being, what she potentially has the capability of doing that could be bad, and is now applying that all to magic and magical beings in general. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And I strongly agree with a lot of what you're saying. I have two things to add for context to this conversation and dialogue and just something to sort of think about. So first and foremost, you have to remember Aelin in particular has incredible power, unprecedented power. I'm thinking back to that part of Heir of Fire when they're talking about how the emissary from Melisande came. And really what he was there for was to assess the threat that Aelin posed to other kingdoms because she had such incredible power that he could destroy them on a whim, right? And so I don't think Chaol's fear here is isolated just to him when it comes to Aelin specifically, not magic as a whole, but Aelin's power. And to your own point, she's incredibly powerful and going to rule a kingdom. That is very scary. she could easily become a Maeve. The differences between
True.
her and Maeve are not that great when you really think about it in terms of their circumstances, right? They could both be queen of a very powerful people and a very powerful kingdom and are very, very powerful, right? And I'm not trying to say that Aelin is bad or anything, but Chaol's perception of Aelin is that she's an assassin. She murders people in cold blood. She almost killed him, right? So I understand that fear. So I just want to keep that in context. Chaol's other exposure to magic is Dorian, who is also extremely powerful, and the king. Two of the three are threats. Dorian, I guess, could be, but he has such a good heart. Like, he's never done anything. He's only used it to protect. But, I mean, he literally just heard her say, I lit an entire city on fire. It didn't burn, but you know what I mean. The second thing, and we've talked about this a lot, so I'm not going to do like a full thing, but you have to think about Chaol's experience. Magic in Aelin was banned for decades before he was born. He's never lived in a world with magic, and he's only been taught to fear it, that it's a bad thing, right? And so you can understand why he in particular would feel that way. Because think about now, if you saw someone come up to you and do something with magic, it would be cool, but you'd be a little freaked out because you're like, whoa, what else can you do? But if you grew up in a world where a lot of people had magic, even if it was just small acts of magic, like making a flower bloom, you would be less alarmed because you've been exposed to it. And so overall, I do agree with most of what you said, but I do want to add that context for Chaol's perspective, why he probably feels that the world is better off without magic, because you can't control the actions of people. And when those people that have very powerful magic, they can cause a lot more damage than a bad person without magic. Think how much of a threat the king would be without magic. I mean, he'd have a lot of armies, but he would be defeatable. It's a level playing field. And again, I'm not saying we should oppress people with magic, all that, right? I still believe all that's true, but I do understand what he's saying, right?
Yeah. I don't blame Chaol for having the conclusions that he does, because he is a product of a system that taught him to feel that way.
Yes, exactly.
However, the outcome of all of this is that I don't think it's productive to say that not having something or not allowing people, in this case, magic wielders, to be a certain way and to be who they were naturally blessed by the word to be, so to speak. That's kind of where I'm like, okay, I think we need to figure out a different solution here, because in the end, keeping other groups down just never ends up being a good solution down the line.
True.
Yeah. All right. Whew. Okay. That was very, very long. If you need to get up and stretch your legs, go do that. But now we have phase 3. And phase 3 is where they separate and individually reflect on what happened. So Chaol thinks about how Selena Sardothian did not exist anymore. The woman he had loved. Perhaps she drowned in the vast, ruthlessly between here and Wendelin. Perhaps she died at the hands of the Valg princes, or maybe he'd been a fool all this time. A fool to look at the lives she'd taken and blood she'd so irreverently spilled and not be disgusted.
One thing that is absolutely right that Chaol just thought is the girl he loved, Selena Sardothian, is gone. Obviously, we know it's a change for the better, but in a way, he's right. Selena did die at the hand of the Valg Princess, and Aelin was reborn. So he is right about that.
I will admit that Aelin's past is not clean by any means, and she has definitely killed people in cold blood as an assassin. But again, I did feel that his assessment is a little lacking in empathy and does not account for many of the awful circumstances that got her to where she is now. Considering her whole past with Erebin, I was having a hard time figuring out how Chaol could A, not realize that Selena had been a product of Erebin and that this is not Aelin as she is today, and B, how messed up it is for him to turn around and work with the person who had thoroughly made Aelin's life one of danger and cruelty. At the end of the day, Chaol's hands are no longer clean at this point. And of course, it's not the same, and it's not to the same extent that Aelin's past has been muddied by, but he has killed people too now. And he also doesn't really seem to judge the other rebels he works with for killing people in the same way he judges Aelin. And I guess his distinction is really like killing out of necessity versus killing out of just rage and a desire for revenge.
Yes. Very similar to the last point. I think I agree with a lot of what you're saying. I do want to add some more Chaol context as a Chaol defender. Here's some context for my baby. I think it's really important to remember that Chaol had never killed anyone before he killed Cain. And remember, it was extremely difficult for him to process. There were several chapters, mentions of him struggling with that. And that is okay. That is normal. I think we get a little desensitized to murder in fiction books because, well, it's fiction. And even more so because we love Aelin. We love her. And we know all of the choices that had been taken away from her that led her to the path that she was, okay? But she is an assassin. And so it's hard to separate that much of Aelin's life decisions, her fault or not, have been morally reprehensible, okay? A lot of what Aelin has done is bad. We need to remember that, right? Killing people is bad, no matter how justified, okay? Chaol had a hard time killing Cain, even though he was a horrible, evil, bad guy who was literally trying to murder his friend, okay? No one should take a life easily, and I think Chaol understands that, and it's pretty core to his character. And I think the last thing you said about killing out of absolute necessity versus, emotion or like preemptively, they have a fundamental different viewpoint on how they view using violence as a means to an end. I feel bad for Chaol because there's going to be a lot of killing for the next several books. But I do think that's important background for Chaol.
So next, we do get some background on Chaol and Nesrin's relationship.
Yes. And before we talk about Nesrin, I want to say, Lorraine, this is something you had mentioned when we were texting about this set of chapters, that her character introduction seems kind of random and out of nowhere. It had never been alluded to that he was entangled with anyone in any way after Lithian, and I agree, it does feel really random. I also feel that a little bit, this is out of character for Chaol. Chaol's character is written as someone who is very honorable, especially when it comes to women. Remember how upset he was all throughout TOG because he thought Dorian was basically trying to take advantage of Selena physically? Remember he even thinks about she could still be a virgin, and he was really worried about that. And I don't think Chaol was virginal or celibate or anything like that, but he is definitely not the type to booty call up against the wall of an alley, okay? I did not like this. This felt like a little bit of character assassination to introduce Nesrin's character and establish her in the timeline before she was introduced, and I didn't like it. It doesn't fit to me. Why are you laughing?
Because my first thought was so our Chaol has a darker side. And now
I just read that.
He is not quite as honorable as we
Yes, he is. No, this is bad writing. She should not have introduced her like this.
Fair enough. I will say it seems kind of out of character for him.
It does.
To take out his feelings by hooking up with this woman in
this alley,
and how he's like, I didn't care about Nesrin. She was just what I needed. Blah, 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 blah. And I was like, oh, okay, Chaol.
You know damn well Chaol is the kind of guy, when he's feeling stressed, he slams a protein shake and hits the gym, okay? That is who Chaol is.
Seems like he doesn't. Seems like he slams something else.
I'm just saying, it doesn't fit.
It did come kind of out of left field with that relation about Chaol's past. Anyways. All right. So Chaol and Nesrin have been hooking up since a year prior as a relief he had needed after Lithian had left him. He also ends up telling her that the king's champion was Aelin because he trusted her after all their work together. Chaol briefly considers how Aelin wouldn't have lied about the prince, but the idea that she might kill him to save him doesn't sit well with Chaol. Nesrin also acknowledges that Dorian's circumstance did indeed change everything, but Chaol at this time has little interest in hearing it. I do think that it's good that Nesrin is unemotional about all this and that she does question Chaol's reactions. I think Aelin also, both of them got to have somebody who's kind of neutral to be like, hey.
No, they do. They need someone who can be impartial. I mean, because someone has to ask the hard questions. It's because of their close relationship to Dorian, it makes it more challenging for them to actually see what's best for the kingdom. Because honestly, what's best for the kingdom is for them to kill the king and kill Dorian. Honestly, if you're being really blunt about it, But of course, we don't want that, right? We want them to find a way to save Dorian and all that. But from a purely non-emotional perspective, bye.
To be honest, prince is not
the vibe.
Ezrin also goes on to inform Chaol of what happened at the vault, and then after she leaves, Chaol considers what Dorian had told him before when he had said, "You do not get to pick and choose which parts of her to love." And I think that is definitely very important to remember.
Yep, that sentence lives rent-free in my head. Lives rent-free in my head. So I did have a question. At the end of his little section, he goes and he pawns the silver ring, which we were joking about earlier. What's the deal with the silver ring he pawned? I remember the amethyst ring, of course, but the one Chaol has, what is that?
Yeah, I do remember that. But in my brain, I was like, oh, maybe they just meant the amethyst ring. Maybe it has silver on it. And instead of saying that it's...
Oh, that's right, because she puts it back in his hand.
Yeah.
Okay, I just got confused because they always refer to it as the amethyst ring. And all of a sudden there is a silver ring. And I'm like, did he have like his own wedding bid or promise ring? I didn't remember her giving him a ring. Oh my God. Okay, thank you. That was really bothering me. I'm like, what is he talking about? I really thought, I was like, was he going to get on one knee or something and be like, baby, let's get married? You know, like, what is he talking? Okay, that makes so much sense. I'm glad I asked because surely
back it up.
I was not the only one who was a little confused about this. Okay.
To continue, for the last part of this chapter, we cut to Aelin, who heads back to her apartment for the first time in several months. When she first gets there, she's like looking around and she finds the note from Ren, which confirms to her that he was the rebel with the twin swords. I don't remember if that was confirmed before this point.
Yes, we did confirm it, but it is a good reminder of their history. Also, I thought this note was so funny. Can you imagine writing a note with the words, "Sorry for trying to kill you this winter"?
Yeah, things have taken a turn since then. So I would like to say I really dislike that Erben had been the one to unpack her books and just like be in her apartment in general. Again, it just gives me the ick that he knows where her apartment is, that he finds his way in there, that he's like shuffling around in her belongings. Like, I don't like it. Aelin decides that she wants to take a bath, and while she's in her bathroom, she looks at herself in the mirror, and she has two thoughts that I think are pretty important and demonstrate her growth and the promise that she is making to herself moving forward. So the first quote is, "That place had never been quite filled again since the day she'd shattered the clock. Maybe she'd also stopped in that moment, stopped living, started just surviving, raging. And maybe it had taken until this spring when she had at last burned through that pain and darkness for the clock to start again. No, she would not add another name of her beloved dead to her flesh."
I do feel this thought was very introspective of Aelin, and I love a good metaphor. I think she's right. She really was just surviving and raging mostly. And I like she stopped there and began again after the events of Heir of Fire. Yeah. And so I thought that was a nice introspective moment for her.
And then the second one that I liked was when she thinks for her friends, for her family, she would gladly be a monster. She could forgive the girl who had needed a captain in the guard to offer stability after a year in hell, forgive the girl who had needed a captain to be her champion, but she was her own champion now. And prior to that, she was just thinking about Chaol's final words and this idea of her being a monster. And it did make me really sad that Aelin was feeling like a monster again because of this conversation with Chaol. I just hope that she continues to remember that getting revenge as a way to satisfy her rage would not ultimately solve the problems that she faces as they move forward in the series.
Yeah, she does need to keep that in mind. You're right. She's also thinking about Chaol and how she once told him, "You remind me of what the world ought to be, what the world can be." Then she goes on to think a girl had said those things, a girl so desperate to survive, to make it through each day, that she hadn't questioned why he served the true monster of their world. And I have to point this out because by her own admission, she has never tried to see Chaol's perspective and worldview. And ultimately, I think this chapter demonstrates two main things. The first is that people change, and they can change dramatically, either through extenuating circumstances or age and experience, or both. Chaol and Aelin have both changed so much, and they have grown apart, but they're too stuck in their past to get to know and accept each other for who they are now. And it will not be until they can do that they can begin to empathize with each other's experiences and worldviews and find a way to come to an understanding. keep in mind, they're very young. Aelin is 19 and Chaol is 23, I think. Okay. And if you are that young, just know you got a lot of changes coming. And if you're older than that, I want you to think about what you were like at those ages.
True.
The second is that people can have the same goal in very different ways to achieve that goal. And people can have very passionate beliefs on the methodologies they choose. Realistically, there are positives and negatives to both of Chaol's and Aelin's plans, but they're too wrapped up in their own feelings to be able to hear each other out and see the merits and pitfalls of each other's plans. I think this is supported in the scenes after they fight, where they are both thinking about the conversation and they both have doubts immediately afterward about how they handled it. And so I am cautiously optimistic with a little bit of soul searching and some growth, they will be able to remedy things and hopefully get on the same page. But yeah, I think ultimately that's what this chapter demonstrates.
I totally agree with that final analysis about where they are. At the end of the day, the tone of their argument felt very much like two scorned lovers bickering and blaming each other because of the past or unresolved feelings. And hopefully they will be able to look past their differences and start working together and stop keeping secrets about important information.
God, we can only hope.
To conclude this chapter, Aelin writes a letter accepting Erebin's offer to help her free Aedion in exchange for a valg demon, and I do not feel good about that at all. It's gonna come back and bite them all in the ass at some point, and
I know, but I feel like they don't have a choice. I feel like they don't have a choice. Man, I do not feel good after this recording. I wish we would have done it at night so I could go back to sleep. But I still have a whole day ahead of me, and I'm just like, feel really hopeless right now. I don't feel great.
Yeah, to everybody listening, thank you for sticking it out with us. With that being said, we just have our favorite moments left to share.
So the first thing that I thought was kind of funny is Erebin sucks, but you gotta hand it to him. He does have good taste. Okay, he does. He's bougie. And I like that. I'm bougie too. I like when Aelin thinks, he said, drinking again, no doubt from a bottle brought in just for him, as there was no way in the dark god's burning realm that Erebin would drink that watered down rat's blood they served at the bar. And the description was just so funny to me. Like, what a gross thing when you think about it. I think her description is funny. I think the fact that he brought his own wine is funny.
That's true. Yeah. Erebin is, yeah, you're right. Bougie is a perfect word to describe him.
He really is.
Suave and bougie. Okay. Mm-hmm. Along the lines of things that Erebin does and says, I did think it was funny when he says, I believe the title our esteemed friends in the Empire now like to use is fire-breathing bitch queen. And then Aelin right after that was like, honestly, she almost found it funny. Flattering even.
On a much sadder note, Aedion freaking Ash River. How does your heart just not melt? He literally did everything in his power to make himself die before he could be used against his beloved queen. God, I just love him. And especially when he thinks it would be such a relief, such a blessed relief to know he couldn't be used against her, and that he would soon see those he had secretly harbored in his shredded heart all of these years. And if you weren't crying, it's heartbreaking to read.
I know. Aedion, don't die on us now. It's too early for that.
Thank you.
And in another emotional quote, it's Chaol's when he's thinking about what Dorian told him. And the line is, you do not get to pick and choose which parts of her to love. Dorian had once said to him, he'd been right. So painfully right.
He was right. Very right.
Everybody's got flaws. So that we don't end on a sad note, my next one is sad. And then Addison's going to share one that's funny. So my last favorite quote, it says, that place that had never quite been filled again since that day she'd shattered the clock. Maybe she'd also stopped in that moment, stopped living and started just surviving, raging. And maybe it had taken until the spring when she was sprawled on the ground while the three valg princes fed on her, when she had at last burned through that pain and darkness, for the clocks to start again. No, she would not add another name of her beloved dead to her flesh.
It is very beautiful writing, but super depressing. So on a happier note, I did think it was particularly funny when Aelin thinks, what a shame that the current owner of the vaults, a former underling of Rourke Farron and a dealer of flesh and opiates, had accidentally run into her knives repeatedly.
Gee, yeah. How
And
did
I'm like,
that happen?
Whoopsie.
Not by accident, that's for sure. Okay. That now officially concludes today's very, very long episode. So thank you all so much for joining us for another episode of the Book on Fantasy podcast. As always, we're so glad you found us. So please leave us a review, subscribe to the podcast, and check out our social media pages to keep up with us on a daily basis. That's all we've got for you guys today. So stay nerdy, everyone.
And remember, you can't be punished for crimes you commit in your head.
Okay, exactly. We will catch you all next week for Queen of Shadows episode 2. Bye.
Bye. For those of you, I put that in the notes when she wasn't paying attention, so she didn't know I was going to say that.
It's true, though. It's true.
Okay, stay tuned for some crazy bloopers. A lot of bloopers, okay? Bye. Just muted myself. That's not what I wanted to do. It is finally time to get to the outstanding question. I even proofread these. I'm just illiterate. The King's Guard entered the vaults, landing on tails. As he entered the king, oh my gosh. The coin was still rotating when the King's Guards entered. I'm not going to scream. I'm going to save the screaming for chapter 7.
You could get like a squish ball and just have it.
I need one. Yeah, just like one of Arabin Hummel's head and just like Dorian has forgotten his. Oops, I just scrolled my notes real hard. Whoops. I got too excited. Okay.
Aelin waits in the vault to meet with Arabin Hummel. Wait.
Hey, Mom. I'm recording right now. No, I'm still going. Yeah. Okay. Bye, Mom. I thought about that. Aedion. He's locked up.
He's locked up and he can't get out.
I can't believe we're going to freaking introduce our playlist and start with fucking Akon. Oh my God. I'm afraid people will just DNF it immediately. They'll be like, nope.
I think it's really fun.
I do too.
This video of me is going to look so weird because I don't have any. You can't see my headphones in my background.
I have a pink ass blanket on. It's cold in my house, but I refuse to turn on the heat because it ain't that cold. Get a blanket, okay?
I cannot be what you want and what you want and what you want me to be.
I'm going to put that in the sign off.
Now, what did I say? I have no idea.
You said so many things, Lorraine.
I can't remember.
Positives and negatives to both of Chaol and Aelon's. To both of oh my God.
Aelin?
Chaol. Oh my God. Okay.